welcome to the public forum on the landfill. This is our third public forum, and you might not know this, but this is also a Board of Public Works meeting. My name is Dave Reckow. I'm chair of the Board of Public Works, and since this is an official meeting of the board, we have to open it and conduct just a little bit of business to start off with. So I'd like to call this meeting to order. The first item of business before we actually go forward is I would like to entertain a motion to accept the videotape in lieu of written minutes.
I move we accept the videotape as our minutes.
Second. And of the board members, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, our board is Mike Parsons in the front here, Terry Culhane, Rose Schmidt, Gary Hartwell, raise your hand, Susan DiMaria, and our newest member, MJ Adams, and we welcome her. This is only her second week, I believe, as a member of the board. What we're doing here is we're conducting a public forum. This is, as I mentioned, the third of what I think will be 4 public forums on the landfill. The first meeting, the first public forum concerned a groundwater model. The second concerned health effects study. And this one involves more of a public input exercise. What we're trying to do with this is to entertain ideas and concepts regarding alternatives. What we're really trying to do is we're seeking public input for viable and responsible alternatives for managing the city's waste. And we have with us some well-known, I would say, world experts in the area of municipal solid waste. We're very fortunate to have with us Gary Liss from Gary Liss Associates. And we also have Sean Worcester and Alan Cohen from HDR, as well as our very own Jim Laurila from the Department of Public Works. And the three will speak about alternatives and zero waste among them. We have a facilitator, and this is Jeff Edelstein, who I'll turn the meeting over to in just a moment. But I just want to take this moment to thank you all for coming, first of all. We really value your input. We are looking forward to some great discussion on alternatives. And this is a very important step for us as a board because we have to, in the coming months, make a decision about whether to apply for a special permit, whether or not to apply for a special permit to expand the landfill. And so, in part, this meeting and the subsequent meeting are intended, as the previous ones were, to help inform the Board of Public Works in making these decisions. The next meeting, which may be our last public forum held by the Board, will be a more formal presentation of the city's consultant, HDR and Stantec, of the option study. And I just want to also mention that we are looking forward to input and comments on the viable and responsible alternatives. We recognize that there are probably some that have not been really tested. In my day job as a professor of environmental engineering and a researcher at UMass, I would love to see the city engage in, or I would love to see research done on this area, but I don't think the city is in a position to fund research, and so we're really looking at options that are well proven. So without further ado, then I'll turn this over to Jeff, and at the end at the end of the presentations we'll entertain, of course, public discussion and comment, and finally we'll plan on closing the meeting with some discussion among the board and the experts who are here. So we're very pleased and very fortunate to have Jeff Edelstein from Consensus Building Institute. Jeff himself is quite experienced in the area of municipal solid waste. So he'll run the meeting from this point.
Thank you, Dave. Is this on? I don't know. And can everybody hear me if I talk like this? People in the back, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not sure you'll be on the
Just so you know, the microphones are so that the television can pick you up.
Okay.
So you need to speak loud in order for the audience to hear you. The mic is just for...
I can use this, but is it on?
It's on for the purpose of
Oh, for
television.
you, okay, then I will go ahead and use this and try and talk loud also. So, thank you, Dave. I'm looking forward to a good, productive evening of discussion, dialogue, debate, deliberation. As Dave said, my name is Jeff Edelstein. I'm a senior consultant with an organization called the Consensus Building Institute out of Cambridge, Mass. And Washington, D.C. I am, as I sometimes refer to myself, a recovering engineer. I have a background in engineering, but that was a number of years ago, and now I work full-time as a facilitator and mediator, trying to help communities and state governments and federal government make decisions and have good constructive dialogue. I did work a number of years ago, as Dave said, on waste issues from a technical standpoint in composting and recycling. Some of the earliest work actually here in Massachusetts with supermarket organic waste recycling. And in more recent years, I've been working in Vermont over the last couple of years, facilitating some planning around waste prevention, and also in Maine on waste planning. My role is to help this conversation be productive tonight. I don't have a whole lot in the way of ground rules. I think everybody here knows how to have a good constructive conversation. The only thing that I would say is that we do want to have, it's almost, debating of ideas. And just like we've seen in the presidential debates, hold your applause until the very end of the evening, and then we can have applause for everybody who has spoken and everybody who has listened. But this is not like American Idol or things like that, where we're going to choose the alternatives based on how much applause anything gets. You can't vote or text in your votes. So what we want to do is make sure that everybody has a chance to be heard, and not have to worry about, oh, am I going to get more applause than that other person before me? You can also give applause to the musicians. Mary, where are you?
It's supposed to be a secret.
Oh, it's a secret that there will be music tonight. But there will be a little break, and there'll be a little bit of landfill music to I'm not sure why, actually. So I think, the only other thing I will say is if you could check your cell phones and put them on something that is silent or stun or anything like that, so it doesn't disturb things. And I think that has covered everything. I'm going to show a few slides to just explain, make sure we all know why we're here tonight. Dave had touched on that, and I'm going to show a little bit more on that. And let's see, Sean, that would be the one. Thanks. So I've been talking with folks from the city and also with some folks in the community to get a sense of what this is all about. And the goal here tonight, as Dave said, is this is a forum on innovative approaches to solid waste management. The forum goal is public input to help guide this waste alternative study that the city is planning to do.
On the right side.
Right side?
Right side. No.
The edge.
Oh,
Okay, but now you're in trouble.
I have to stop.
Right side towards you.
No. This.
that thing right there? Oh, okay. See, this is why I'm not an engineer anymore. All right, so what is the issue here? As I've understood it from talking with the city, the issue is that the Northampton Regional Landfill will reach capacity in 2011, and the landfill currently serves two functions. Primary function is it provides a means of waste disposal for Northampton residents and for the surrounding region. A secondary function, as it's been described to me, and this is secondary, which is it provides some financial support for city services to residents, and it provides a subsidy to residential direct disposers, i.e. those people who bring their materials to the transfer stations or drop-off rather than having subscription services actually have reduced, it subsidizes that disposal fee. But the real issue here is that the city is looking at what happens in 2011. Is it going to continue to provide a means of waste disposal? Or maybe not. Maybe the city will say, you know, we're going to leave people on their own. We've examined the alternatives. But that's what they're trying to figure out. Did I skip one? Sean, can you run these for me? Thanks.
Just let me know.
Okay, next one. Okay, next slide. Okay, so who's commissioning this study? The Board of Public Works is the one that is commissioning this study. Why is that? It's because they are the city body that will be making this initial decision about which alternative to pursue, if any. And if they were to decide not to pursue any, as I understand it, then the Board of Health has to decide whether the city needs to do anything to help residents with their waste or not. But it is the Board of Public Works which has that authority, and that's why they're the ones who are doing this study. Next. Why is the study needed? I think that's a question that might be on people's minds because people know that it's been planned to do this landfill expansion, and it's been looked at, so why this new study? As I understand it, the new study is because over the last several years, there's been a recognition within the city that there are emerging technologies that have come along and emerging approaches and concepts like the zero waste concept that Gary Liss will be talking about and that Alan Cohen from HDR will talk about. So the landscape has kind of changed, and the city is saying, well, let's take a look now and kind of see if this is the right approach to take. The other thing is, I think as people are probably all aware of, climate change, which wasn't on the tips of our tongues just a few years ago, is now front and center as a clear environmental issue. And there's a recognition that waste is part of the climate change issue, that how we manage our waste has a carbon footprint. And so the city also wants to look at that in terms of the alternatives. How will the study be done? Methodical assessment, taking a look at the economics, the environmental impacts, and what are the social and community aspects of these different alternatives in order to potentially continue to provide residents with a means to manage their solid waste. Next. So the study process is, we're here tonight at the forum. After the forum, the slides that you will see tonight will be available at the Department of Public Works website. You can also email your input on any further thoughts by next week, the day before Thanksgiving. Just get them in by the end of the day. There is the email address. And the city will be considering what it hears tonight and gets for comments. I should also add, there are some comment cards on the table by the door, so feel free to grab one of those and write any questions or comments down if you're not somebody who likes to go up to a microphone and speak and be on TV. And we will just leave those on the table. We'll collect those so that the city can have those. After that, the city will be determining which alternatives should it be studying. Maybe some of them just don't make any sense and it's not worth putting time into. Maybe there are things that they learned tonight that they didn't know about. They will then be putting together and contracting for the study. They will make the scope of the study, i.e. what alternatives they're going to assess and how they're going to do that. That'll be available at the DPW website. They'll then move ahead and conduct this study. Then there'll be an update to the Board of Public Works at a public meeting as the study progresses, you know, probably halfway through, but sometime through, the consultant will come back and say, here's how we're doing. And then there'll be a final report to the DPW at a public meeting. And then last, the board will then make a decision on what it wants to do. And I believe that's it. So that's just to give you an overview, and your input is really important to help them figure out how to go about moving through this study. What we're going to see tonight is, I hope you all have your agendas. If you need an agenda, there are some up here. Anybody need one? Okay, thanks, Gary. If you could, when you're done with your agenda tonight, leave it on the table over there. and I'm going to take them all home, and I can use them as one-side printed paper and use them as my scrap paper. Or you can keep them if you want a memento from tonight. What we're going to do is you're going to hear first from Jim Laurila, the city engineer, to just give you an overview of what is the current situation with the landfill and how the city manages waste. Then we're going to hear from Gary Liss, who is an expert on zero waste issues. And then we'll hear from Alan Cohen and Sean Worcester with HDR, who are going to talk about kind of the big picture of different alternatives to moving forward. Then we will have public comment and give everybody an opportunity to come up and speak and ask questions. And that includes, we'll probably take general public comment for about an hour, and then we want to make sure and give the members of the Board of Public Works some time to ask some questions also, because they're trying to learn about this too. And then we'll probably take a break, we'll hear a song, and then we'll adjourn the meeting, which we're targeted to do at 10 o'clock. So, that is our planned agenda for tonight. What we would like to do is, as you hear the presentations, to hold your questions and your comments so we can get through those. And some things that you may have questions on may become clear as you hear other slides. I do encourage you to write down your comments or questions as those slides go through so you can remember them and be sure to ask them. Okay? So, if I haven't missed anything, I believe, Jim, it's over to you to give you the overview of the current program.
Thank you, Jeff. Can everybody hear me okay in the back? Okay, I'll try to maintain my volume here and not fade off. I just wanted to take a couple of minutes before we turn over to Gary and HDR, just to sort of set the stage for folks, as a reminder of what the city currently provides for solid waste management systems, and to get everyone to focus in on the different aspects of what it takes to manage solid waste in a community. And I think the best way to do that is just to sort of run through some of the programs that we have and the facilities that the city relies on right now for solid waste management. So the first slide is just a summary of how solid waste and recyclables get collected in our community. And basically what we have is there are two methods that are used by residents depending on their own personal preference. The first one is some residents can get a vehicle sticker and use the pay-by-bag sticker system to use the drop-off facility either at the Glendale Road landfill or at the Locust Street Recycling Center at the DPW. There's also a portion of the community that choose to have curbside collection of their waste and recyclables at their home by contracting with a private hauling company, where they would just come to your home and take your waste and recyclables away and send you an invoice periodically that you would pay for directly. So there's a couple of different sort of a hybrid system that we use here in town for waste collection. Next slide. This slide is a summary of some of the solid waste related programs that the city offers right now. We do routine household hazardous waste collection events. We maintain a leaf and yard waste composting facility at the landfill. We do other sorts of recycling as well. Within the community, we do clean wood recycling, scrap metal recycling at the landfill. We also do scrap metal recycling at Locust Street. Universal waste collection, which is battery collections and mercury-containing devices, thermostat collections, that sort of thing. We do other programs such as backyard compost bin distributions for folks that are interested in doing food waste composting in their backyards. Electronics recycling programs, paper shredding, and other events, and other community support for events related to solid waste and recycling. So I'm getting the sense here that my latest, most updated slides aren't the ones that are being shown, but what I wanted to touch on briefly was the first item that I mentioned was how waste is collected at the curb. Either people use the drop-off centers or they have someone come pick it up. The city also has some hauling operations that have to move the material that's collected here in town The recyclables collected at Glendale Road get hauled to Springfield through a contract that the city has with Solid Waste Solutions. So there's some hauling there to get our recyclable materials, the bottles and cans and paper, to Springfield, and from the Springfield Materials Recovery facility to the recycling marketplace. It's a little bit different at the Locust Street Drop-Off Center. We actually have city staff and a truck that does the hauling of waste collected at Locust Street that's brought to the landfill, and we also haul recyclables from Locust Street to the Springfield Materials Recycling Facility. So there's different hauling operations. We collect the material, and that's how we get it to the next step to get them to the marketplace. So the slide that's up now, you can go back, Sean. So once the facilities that we rely on, I mentioned, are the Springfield Materials Recycling Facility. For leaf and yard waste composting, we maintain a static pile compost facility at the landfill for folks that use that. And then for solid waste disposal, we have the landfill. Just a quick overview of the landfill. I think most folks are knowledgeable in terms of the current operation of the landfill. We have 16 towns that send all their waste to the current landfill. We have memorandum of understanding with 39 communities. The balance of the communities don't currently use the landfill, although they have the right to use it if they so choose. All the memorandum of understanding that we have with other communities has several requirements to that, including that they're required to have recycling programs and either participate or collect household hazardous waste to remove those aspects of the waste stream from the waste that goes into the landfill. A little bit more background on the landfill. The landfill's been in operation since 1969. Several phases of the landfill are capped. We're currently operating in phase 4. We have a permit limit established by the Department of Environmental Protection at 50,000 tons per year. And as Jeff had mentioned earlier, we have capacity until about the end of 2011, which is why we're here talking about alternatives and having discussions about the proposed landfill expansion and other alternatives. A little bit of background on the waste that goes into the regional landfill. In 2007, about 49,000 tons went into the landfill in 2007. Quick breakdown on some of that material that goes in. About 6% of the 49,000 is brought to the landfill from the city drop-off centers at Locust Street, and the waste that's collected at Glendale Road at the drop-off that the residents use. 11% of the waste that came into the landfill was from the 16 member towns that have a memorandum of understanding that I just mentioned. About 2% of the waste coming in is from Smith College, and then the balance, which is about 80%, is classified as commercial waste, which is hauled in from private haulers, from area businesses, residents that use curbside collection through private haulers, and then other city institutions like the VA hospital, the county jail, Clark School, and other institutions. So that gives you a sort of a quick snapshot of the waste that goes into the landfill. The last slide that I wanted to touch on is related to the Solid Waste Enterprise Fund. I just wanted to give a quick overview. I've got a few points here. The Solid Waste Enterprise Fund, the city runs its solid waste enterprise like a business. There's a separate accounting system for that. All the revenues that are in the fund are based on users of the facility, so whether they be residents that get vehicle stickers and buy stickers for their bags, or whether it's tip fees that are paid by haulers at the landfill, those revenues go into the enterprise fund and help pay for the operation of the facility. The fiscal year 06 operating budget was about $3.3 million. That budget is still more or less in that $3 million range. And again, the solid waste disposal fees, other revenues pay for the cost of system operations. And then, as Jeff had mentioned in one of his earlier slides, some of the money from the enterprise fund helps to offset the cost of waste disposal for the residents of the community, and some of the enterprise fund monies go back into the city general revenue to support other city for citywide use. I guess they go into the general fund. So that sort of provides an overview, which hopefully will get you focused in on the types of facilities and things that we need to consider as we move ahead in terms of collecting the waste, where it goes, how we recycle, what types of programs we need, and what some of the alternatives are. So the last slide I have here is next. It's a pleasure to have Gary Liss here this evening with us to talk about zero waste. Gary has a lot of experience in that area, and I was enjoying the topic of his presentation tonight, which is to cool the planet. And it seems like he's doing a pretty good job based on the temperatures out there today. So, turn that over to you, Gary.
So just to mention, I guess a couple of credits here. First of all, we need to really thank the Citizens United group for bringing Gary here, because without them, that connection wouldn't have been made, and that's really wonderful. Just briefly, Gary works from Loomis, California. He happened to be here on the East Coast for another activity tomorrow over in Boston, so this was a great synergy to have this work. Gary's worked on more zero waste community plans than any other individual in the U.S. He's got 35 years of experience in the solid waste and recycling field. He was a founder and past president of the National Recycling Coalition, solid waste manager for the city of San Jose, California. He has written zero waste plans for a number of communities. He's now working for the cities of Los Angeles and San Jose. A whole host of things that I won't even go through. And Gary has in the past and is currently working with HDR on some projects. So it's just great to have both of them here to be able to talk about things. Over to you, Gary. Great.
Could we move this podium? It's blocking a lot of...
Okay. And also, I don't know if I want to turn out the lights because it's getting late and maybe that'll make things sleepy. Is everybody able to see okay, the slides? All right.
Okay, thank you all for coming out tonight. Want to get a sense of how many people have heard of zero waste before? All right, great. How many people are for zero waste? Okay, well that sounds great. Well, let me give you some background on what you can share with your neighbors and friends to get them on board as well then. How many people have heard reduce, reuse, recycle? This is one of the most well-known phrases in America. And we're taking it back for zero waste because if we really reduced, reused, and recycled everything, we'd be pretty darn close to zero waste. So, and it's one of the things that really is a hallmark that everyone knows, so let's build on that. But what we need to do is focus more on the reducing and the reusing, and then recycling and composting are actually the last resorts. And we'll tell you why that's so important through the presentation. This is the only internationally accepted, peer-reviewed definition of zero waste by the Zero Waste International Alliance. It's on their website at zwia.org. And the two things that are highlighted here is that all discarded materials are resources for others to use, and we don't want to burn or bury those resources. The connections between zero waste and global warming are huge, and we're beginning to understand how significant they are. One of the first things that EPA highlighted are the connections with landfill gases. Landfills are one of the largest sources of greenhouse gases. The majority of the gas that's produced from landfills is methane. Methane is 21 to 23 times as potent as carbon dioxide over a 100-year period, which is the general time frame that all the calculations are done about greenhouse gases. But it's actually in the next 10 to 20 years that we'll be reaching the tipping point on climate change. And over a 20-year horizon, that multiplier is actually on the order of 72 times as potent as carbon dioxide, because methane works faster in the atmosphere in the greenhouse effect than does carbon dioxide. So it's really important to keep the stuff out of being created in an uncontrolled environment that lets methane out into the atmosphere. The wasteberg is the second piece that we really try to highlight, that for every ton in front of us of solid waste in our landfill, there's 71 tons upstream of mining, manufacturing, and distribution waste created to get to this point in front of us. And as a result, we can't recycle our way out of this mess. We've got to stop the flow. We've got to eliminate waste, reduce waste, design waste out of the system, and for those things that are continuing, we need to reuse them as much as possible, because we need to stop that 71 tons from being wasted up front. So because of the Wasteberg effect, the 71 multiplier there, the 72 multiplier on the methane, you see that we're starting to look at really significant numbers. When you look at the EPA estimates of global warming, they don't all add up to this. They right now show solid waste as being 3% of the national, but the latest studies from an EPA researcher are saying that things may be on the order of 36% of the total greenhouse gases are affected by policies that we could have influenced through zero waste. Using the existing EPA models on calculating the effects of global warming, in California we found that if you apply those models to all the waste that's currently being landfilled, it would be, if we recycled and composted all those materials, it'd be the equivalent of taking all the automobiles off the road. And we all understand that transportation and automobiles is a huge part of global warming. In 2005, the United States was the host for the first time of World Environment Day, and that was in San Francisco. And the mayor of San Francisco challenged the 100 largest cities of the world to meet urban environmental accords, to go beyond what the federal governments have been doing, not rising to the challenge. And those urban environmental accords are one of several different cool city programs that are now available, that progressive communities around the country and around the world are pursuing in order to address climate change at the local level. And the Urban Environmental Accords is the only Cool Cities program that includes zero waste as one of its key goals. Communities all over the world are adopting zero waste as a goal. Large communities, small communities, urban, rural, suburban. Canberra, Australia was the first, the capital of Australia in the early 90s. New Zealand is the first country on earth to have adopted zero waste as a goal, and South Korea and Scotland are the next two countries that have adopted it. Over 2/3 of the cities in New Zealand have adopted zero waste. It was a grassroots effort that bubbled up from the grassroots, community by community adopting zero waste goals and trying to figure out how to get there and pooling their resources, working together. Large cities like Buenos Aires and Toronto are pursuing it. Los Angeles, we're working on a zero waste plan now. Telluride, Colorado, a small town of about 10,000 population, they get 550,000 visitors a year. So they have some interesting dynamics there. I just finished a zero waste plan there. So we have a lot of examples. One of the things that you'll notice, there's a lot of California cities there, and that's because in 2001 the state adopted a strategic plan to guide solid waste in the state. One of its 8 goals in the strategic plan was zero waste. And now on the homepage of the California Waste Board, you'll see their goal is to achieve a zero waste California, and all of their programs they view as contributing to that goal. By the state taking that step, it provided political cover and leadership for communities to pursue zero waste, and legitimized it as a goal that made sense and was something that should be pursued. And as a result, we now have 22 communities in California that have adopted zero waste, which is the largest group in the country. Okay. A lot of people, as you get into zero waste, they raise their eyes and say, oh yeah, right, how are we going to get to zero? And Eric Lombardi, the head of the EcoCycle in Boulder, Colorado, was walking down the streets of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, about 10 years ago, when we were debating, could we be so audacious to call upon America to pursue zero waste? And we had some accountants and engineers in the group debating this. And he said, well, why don't we say zero waste or damn close? And everyone laughed about it and said, yeah, that's it. And that got sanitized to darn close. But that's the idea. Because the point of zero is not the destination, it's the journey. It's moving down to try and get rid of all the waste. If you accept 50% as your goal, then anything that isn't consistent with that, isn't so bad. But if you're striving for zero, everything's on the table. If you're striving for zero, you've got to look at why is it being created in the first place? Where's the source of the creation? How do we redesign the system? How do we design the waste out of the system? Because waste is just a design decision. It's not inevitable. Zero waste addresses those issues. And as we got into it, we were excited to find that businesses were leading the way to zero waste. Businesses all over the world are diverting over 90% of their waste from landfills and incinerators. And in Japan, 2,800 businesses adopted zero waste as a goal, and 99% have already achieved zero to landfill, which was the actual Japanese goal, Japanese government set. And it was in response to the Japanese Ministry of the Environment asking their businesses to take Kyoto Protocol seriously in the 90s, and they worked to achieve those efforts. And you'll see some of the companies on this list are also Japanese companies in this country. A lot of them have operations in this country, like Toyota and Ricoh and Epson are on the list, and Numi. But again, with the businesses, it's large businesses, small businesses, electronic firms, organic firms, all different shapes and sizes, all different types of locations. So it's not that zero is special to anything, it just requires a special effort. Any business should be able to achieve 30 to 50% recycling with just existing activities. To get to 60 to 80%, they have to work a little bit at it. But to get over 90% diversion, they're really working it. They're really designing the waste out, they're focusing on reuse, and they're working on recycling. Why do businesses do that? We asked the business community to give us some feedback on that, and what Margaret Bruce said from the Santa Clara Valley Manufacturing Group, two basic reasons: to save money, and it's the right thing to do. We asked Bank of America, are there other things that motivate businesses? And they came up with this list, particularly managing risks and decreasing liabilities. How long does waste belong to a business? Anyone want to venture a guess at that? Forever. Forever, yes. We got a winner there. Under CERCLA, the Superfund Act, when you dispose of waste and it goes to a landfill and that landfill leaks, the attorneys and the accountants just see who contributed to that landfill, how much did they contribute, and they send you the bill in the mail. And under the current standards, there's a likelihood that most landfills will leak at some point in some fashion, and so it's a liability that hangs out there that needs to be addressed. Avoiding penalties and benefiting from incentives in a zero-waste design system. The marketing edge. How many people here have seen the Toyota commercial with the disappearing car, where the car is made out of thatch and mud and twigs and all natural elements? It disappears into the ground, and the voiceover says, we're not only for zero emissions, we're for zero waste. And what they're saying there is, we're the greenest of the green. They don't cite EPA reports, they don't cite statistics. They show visually, so people get it in their gut, that zero is better than anything else as far as being the greenest of the green. So it's a real marketing edge. And it's responding to shareholder and consumer pressure for wanting greener businesses. It also addresses fundamental efficiencies in the marketplace. Businesses, on average, are wasting 90 to 95% of everything they buy. Gil Friend of Natural Logic does sustainability audits, and he goes in and looks at how much energy, material, products are purchased to make their own products. And this was a sample that he showed at a conference a couple of years ago, where the blue was contributing to the product and the gray on the slide was not. In this case, about 2/3 was going to waste. And when he shows that type of calculation to the CEOs of the companies he works for, they say, my God, I'm spending all that money to go to waste? We've got to do something better. Zero Waste strives to build on that. And how it does it is, these are the pillars we came up with in the Zero Waste Plan for Oakland, looking upstream at that 71 tons, downstream, and looking at green businesses and jobs. The upstream is the 71 times the number of tons in front of you that's from mining, manufacturing, and distribution of waste. If you look at the origin of that, most of the organics over the last 40 years have been relatively constant. Yard trimmings and food scraps, food contaminated paper, wood is relatively constant. It's the products that have been spinning out of control, almost approaching an exponential curve. And for those who know biology, when you see exponential curves in nature, that means that there's no feedback. There's something wrong with the system. The system is going out of control. And that's what's happening here. We don't have the system working. In Palo Alto, we came up with the phrase that local businesses are our friends who we want to help them become zero-waste businesses to get all these benefits that we're highlighting. But it's the system that's broken. We've got to figure out how do we get the feedback into the system to get it to work the way it should. One of the key tools for that is extended producer responsibility, EPR. And we have lots of examples. You have one of the leading programs in the country on beverage deposit bottles. That's an EPR program, having the bottles go back to where you bought them from. We've got it in California for beverage containers, slightly different way. Lots of other things. Just recently, anyone that sells a cell phone or a rechargeable battery has to take back the old ones from anyone who brings it to them. Downstream, it's the reduce, reuse, recycle. Reducing is highlighting that waste is not inevitable. We can design this out. This is a system of, anyone here, waste not, want not? How about use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without? Anyone hear that one from grandparents or others? That may come back in vogue this next 6 months, I'm thinking. But the point is, we used to be really frugal as a nation. We got away from that for a variety of reasons. We can change that. We can change that by policies and choices that individuals make, that companies make, that communities make, and say, we've had enough, we need to move on to a new approach. Reuse in the original form and function is really the key. If you take an old door that you get from a reuse store, like the Restore down in Springfield, and you want to put that on your house, how much would that cost to buy that wood door? Anyone? $100. That's typical in other places. If you chip that up for energy or made it into compost, how much would be the value of that? About 25 to 50 cents is what I estimate. So the point is that in reuse, the value is in the form and the function. All that embodied energy, all that embodied design, all it took to get that product to your doorstep is what the value is of that. In Los Angeles, when we looked at this issue, how much Los Angeles in the LA Zero Waste Plan they're throwing away, we estimate about $100 million a year, and they're already at 62% waste diversion. So of the remaining stuff, the value of the remaining stuff being thrown away is about $100 million. Of that $100 million, $40 million is from 2% of the waste stream of reusables at $550 a ton on average. So the value is almost more important, particularly today in the current economic situation we're at. The value in terms of jobs creation, in terms of cash flow in terms of opportunities to do something different is one of the huge opportunities that's out there from a small portion of the waste stream. And then the bottom line is to recycle or compost the rest as the last resort. Resource recovery parks is a concept where we're looking at things like shopping malls and airports as an example, basically trying to co-locate reuse, recycling, composting activities to make it a one-stop shop where you can bring everything you have, handle it all at once, and be convenient for the public, provide lower waste fees, and develop the design so that you actually squeeze waste out. This is a graphical design of a process in an example in UK that we worked on, where you have people coming in, dropping off at their reusables, their recyclables for free. Then they may have to pay to get rid of some of their other recyclables for C&D and compost, and then some of their chemicals they might have to pay for, and they would have to pay for even more at the end to waste it. So by both the price signals and the layout and the design and the flow of the facilities, you're using the design to accomplish more diversion and get the signals to people that if they layer their pickup load with the waste on the bottom and the reusables on top, and they offload the cheap stuff or the free stuff first, that's the way that they fit in with your system. They win, you win. It's a win-win situation all around. There's several examples of this we've documented in a number of years ago. Monterey Resource Recovery Park. One of the key concepts is like a shopping center, a lot of the value is in leasing out the space. So like in your landfill here, you could lease out space to private operators. Like in this case, in Monterey, they leased out space to a local composter. They leased out space to an asphalt and concrete recycler. They have a chip tire storage area. They have also their public commercial MRF, a last chance mercantile for reusable items. It's co-locating all the reuse, recycling, composting, but it's not all owned by the government. It's a partnership, a public-private partnership, which is another key concept of the Resource Recovery Park approach. The San Luis Obispo Resource Recovery Park is more like a resource recovery center where you just have all the different types of materials being easily dropped off in categories right at the landfill before you go in. Similar to what you have probably already with just a little, some additional considerations could go into that perhaps to elaborate on. They didn't need to have some of the processing activities here because processors were nearby, so all they needed was a place where everyone could drop off that were self-hauling materials in. In Del Norte County, 30,000 population, northernmost county in California, the Resource Recovery Park there, 70 to 80% of the materials come in there by self-haul, by individuals bringing it in themselves. So that's where that design that I went over with the UK really applies, where you're getting people to be really careful on how they bring this stuff to you so they minimize their costs and maximize the recovery. And this is being implemented on a phased basis right now. Urban ore, one of the landmarks of reuse in Berkeley. There are many places like this now for used building materials. One of the big opportunities, like the Restore in Springfield, there's a huge opportunity for used building materials to be recovered in lots of different ways. Some of the keys for Resource Recovery Park success are co-locating with your existing waste flow at transfer stations or at landfills. There could be lots of resource recovery centers, resource recovery park concepts in this area given what you have already in place. A key is looking at how to harness the avoided costs of transfer and disposal. In the Del Norte case, when we did the feasibility study, we said that it's going to cost them, we estimated about $75 to $100 a ton to dispose of their waste. And we said that the contract between the public authority, the Del Norte Waste Authority, and the transfer operator should say that if they can that they have to reduce, reuse, recycle anything that costs them less than the cost of transfer and disposal. So if they could pay someone $50 a ton to recycle it or reuse it, it would be cost effective because it would be less than shipping it for $75 to $100 elsewhere. And harnessing that cost contractually is one of the key tools that we highlighted to them. The price actually ended up being $110 a ton for their transfer and disposal. Different operator incentives and rules is a part of this, involving local recycling businesses as partnerships, so building on your existing infrastructure and giving them room to expand, providing them help in expanding and an opportunity to be part of a resource recovery park. Making sure that you have the rate structure so that materials that come in source separated pay less than if they come in on a mixed basis as mixed waste. And building on reuse as the first priority. Green businesses and jobs is this third component of the zero waste planning in Oakland. There we were really concerned about a lot of the recycling businesses were being forced out through zoning, that the highest and best use from a land use perspective was retail and residential in Oakland, not the traditional industrial base. So the industrial base was being squeezed out. So we were trying to address that issue by this message. Reserving sufficient land for the zero waste infrastructure. If they really wanted to be a sustainable city, they needed to understand that they can't squeeze out all the processing that's needed to accomplish that on an efficient basis. But it also recognizes the green collar jobs of the future. That today, if you have 10,000 tons of waste and you bury it, it only creates one job. If you compost 10,000 tons of material, it creates 4 jobs. If you recycle 10,000 tons, it creates 10 jobs. And if you reuse 10,000 tons of reusables, it creates 75 to 250 jobs. And again, this is another measure of where reuse comes in, as it's the value, not the tons, that are so important to understand and need to be designing your systems to build upon the value, not just the tons. And to do that, to support that, buying green goods and services as one of the things that the public sector could do. One of the things we highlight is that the recycling and reuse industry today in America is the size of the automobile industry. And in California, the recycling industry is the size of the motion picture industry. These are huge industries. They're just distributed throughout the economy. I call it the invisible investment. People don't see it, but an average paper mill is $1 billion. So there's a lot of money involved. So the key issue is, how do we get there from here? How do we help businesses be green? And communities have done a variety of things to adopt policies, incentives, and rules and regulations to help their businesses move in this direction. To ask them to adopt goals, plans, principles, targets, keep the materials clean and source separated, and to recycle all different types of materials. Using incentives, local government is in a unique position to change what's currently economic for everyone to participate by some of the ways you establish the rules and the rate structures and how you influence the marketplace. Through contracts, ordinances, garbage rates, policies on zoning and land use and general plans. There's lots of ways that can be influencing the economics of what happens locally. And so the goal is to pay for what you want, more waste diversion, and pay less for wasting. And maybe not contract for the wasting. One of the latest things we suggested in Carroll County, Maryland, was don't put or pay contracts for landfill. Don't put or pay contracts for guaranteed flow of waste if what you're trying to do is reduce waste. Let it go to the free market. If those prices go up, all the better, because then reuse and recycling looks better. Why work against ourselves? We need to recognize waste as a symptom of inefficiency and harness the forces of the marketplace to achieve our goals. This is one of the last slides highlighting how to deal with the current market meltdown that we're having. I think I'm over time, but I'll briefly say extended producer responsibility, getting businesses involved in trying to look at how to deal with keeping the flow of materials by bringing a new partner in to work with us in addressing the current market condition. Using the crisis of today as an opportunity to change to a sustainable system, to get away from the system that's broken now and work to figure out using the market downturn as an opportunity to get us all together so we can get more efficiencies for everyone involved. Requiring recycling goals and recycling content are some of the key tools for doing that we've done in other communities and on other states. Allowing charges for recycling services, basically allowing recyclers to charge to have materials picked up. In some communities that is not allowed. Being more careful about your collection and processing specifications in terms of demanding that materials are clean and high quality going into the markets. Focusing on local value-added markets, particularly for reuse and organics and C&D, but organics is generally about half of what's remaining in the waste stream. Particularly focusing on food scraps and food-contaminated paper as a key one. How do we develop local domestic markets nearby while we have this worldwide economic downturn for products? Let's focus on the organics, which is half of our waste stream remaining anyway. Let's use this as an opportunity to focus there and on the reuse and value issues. Strengthening green building connections for reuse and recycling, and recognizing that it's not about landfills, it's about the climate. That's what this is all about. We've got 10 to 20 years, folks. Zero waste is one of the quickest, cheapest, most cost-effective ways of addressing climate change that local governments can do. The plans that have been developed for climate change by local governments are documenting that. So we need to recognize that it's climate change that we're working to address. So everything needs to be questioned. It's not whether we can make incremental progress, is how do we get to zero waste is the question. How does nature do this? With 3.5 billion years of experience, how does nature do without high temperature incineration? How does nature do without landfills? We need to study what nature's done, apply that to our challenges, and figure out the more cost-effective ways to go in the future. There are a lot of resources out there. This will be available for you to get off the website. And this question is moot for you. If you're not for zero waste, how much waste are you for? But instead, I'll lead you in the Mike Paparian cheer, which turns this question around and says, how much waste are you for? Zero. Okay. Mike can't hear you in California. How much waste are you for? Zero. Okay, there's another group down the end of the hall. They can't even hear you. How much waste are you for? Zero. Okay, thank you.
All right, so thank you, Gary. If we could just harness Gary's energy as an energy source, then maybe that would help solve some things. Thank you. I talked with Gary beforehand and asked him, Gary, how much time do you want? And originally he had said if he was going to come here, he said he needed at least 15 or 20 minutes. And beforehand he said, cut me off at 15, Jeff, because I really want to make sure we have time for questions. But I couldn't do it. So Gary had a good 30 minutes, and there was just too much there. So I hope everybody's okay with that, but I just couldn't bring myself to say, Gary, stop. What I'd like to do is, actually right now, because we have a lot ahead of us, in the same spirit of raising the energy level, there's a lot that HDR wants to present to you. So I want to ask at least half of you, I won't ask all of you, but at least half of you, please stand up. Come on, half of you. And shake your legs around and move your arms, or do the recycling throw, throwing your can into the bin. But just get a little bit of stretching, because we got a little, more presentation ahead of you. Okay, that's good. You can sit down now. I don't want to hold things up too much here. We're going to hand things over to HDR. To talk about innovative approaches to managing Northampton solid waste. I will let Alan and Sean introduce themselves and tell you about their background. So over to you guys.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. The whole purpose of this presentation is to sort of provide to you some things that describe certain alternative processes for dealing with waste, hopefully in an informative way so that you can see what is available, what's not available that might be used here in Northampton, and hopefully in a clear and unbiased way as we can. My name is Alan Cohen. A couple of things about myself. I'm a UMass grad. Won't say how many years ago that was. And I've been a solid waste professional for over 30 years, and I've been with HDR for about the last 12 years. Prior to that, I did a lot of work on the environment, helped set up one of the first drop-off centers in the country in Naperville, Illinois, and helped develop after actually the first Earth Day in 1970, helped develop a lot of the air regulations here that we've been living with in the United States. What the first slide shows is that, as far as HDR is concerned, we are the #1 solid waste consulting firm in the country in accordance with engineering news records, reports, and what we like to describe our approach is no wasted resources. See if I can get this to work. There we go. As Gary had pointed out, a cornerstone of any solid waste program is reduce, reuse, and recycle. And I want to talk a little bit about collection. Jim had identified that here in Northampton, you currently have a drop-off at Locust Street as well as the Glendale Landfill, and you also can have subscription services for collection. Now, a lot of the techniques that are used for solid waste management are a function of how you collect the waste. And another alternative that the study could look at is a citywide curbside collection program with either selection of source-separated waste at the curb, or in some communities, and we'll talk about the technology this applies to, where you would actually pick up everything at the curb and you do the separation at a facility. We're going to talk about waste processing or conversion. This is very important in terms of when you look at recycling, particularly if you want to get to zero waste. A lot of it has to do with conversion. And a lot of the emerging technologies are dealing with processing or conversion of solid waste. And then finally, any solid waste management program, at least today and for the foreseeable future, is going to have some place to put the residual. Something that's left over after you do your reduce, reuse, recycle, your processing and so forth. There has to be a place for whatever is left over. And then once it's in the landfill or it's at a disposal site, you'll see that there's a possibility of even recovering more resources. So the concept is no wasted resources as we go forward. When you look at solid waste management, we like to look at 5 different aspects of a particular program. If we start with the lower left side, certainly we want what we do to be environmentally sound. Second, we want to make sure that it can be implemented. It's something that you can actually make work in the functionality. It should be affordable, or at least you should know what it's going to cost you when you make your decisions. And then finally, it should be something that the community is willing to embrace. And that's part of the reasons for this particular forum is to give you some of the information you will need, and you'll get feedback back to the city so that they can come up with something that would work for you. Outline of our presentation. We're going to give you a little bit more about zero waste. As was indicated before, we've worked with Gary in other locations. You'll actually see some slides that look familiar, and that's not just a happenstance, it's just because we've worked together before. We do have a slightly different point of view on some aspects relative to zero waste, and that has to do a lot with waste processing and conversion. We will then talk about some of the established technologies that are out there, what's being used, and then some of the emerging technologies. And then finally, we're going to talk about carbon footprint. Now, Sean and I are going to split the presentation, hopefully, because we have a lot to cover. and hopefully that will make it a little bit, I guess, more enjoyable or informative for you. I'm going the wrong way. Oops. John, I'm giving away your presentation. I just want to introduce you first. Sean's going to talk about zero waste, and a lot of what he's going to present to you, he presented to DEP here in Massachusetts about 2 years ago. He's also given presentations on zero waste to the U.S. Conference of Mayors about a year ago, so that he has been working with HDR's Zero Waste Group. A lot of it is centered out in California, as Gary mentioned, and our National Director of Zero Waste, Ruth Abbey, is available to be working with us on this particular effort.
Thanks, Alan. Thank you. Good evening, everybody. I appreciate you taking time out of obviously very busy schedules and the opportunity to tell you a little bit about some of the things that we've been working on at HDR. Can everybody hear me okay?
A little louder.
A little louder? Okay. Sorry about that. Just by way of a brief introduction, I've been in the solid waste business since 1980. I started out with dark hair, and as you can see, it's been an interesting 25, 30 years. Part of that was actually representing 23 municipalities who had the misfortune of having probably the worst disposal deal in the country, the Neswick communities, which if you're in Massachusetts, Neswick is actually, it's a verb. You've been Neswick if you've entered into a very bad public-private partnership. I guess the good news for me is I didn't do it, I didn't put the deal together, and was brought in to help sort it out. I think I learned a lot through that process. One of the things that I learned is that for municipalities and for the residents, management of trash and the resources that they represent is a very important issue, and it has a lot of implications in terms of what's going on in the community, and also economic implications. I mean, the communities I represented, they were in a situation where the additional costs that they were paying for the disposal of what was left over after they reduced, reuse, recycle, represented policemen and firemen that they couldn't hire and that they couldn't give raises to. So I think it's very important that we look at this in the context overall of how do we manage our resources in a way that's economically and environmentally sound. And that's part of what I wanted to talk a bit about tonight. I think as you've heard, we've been involved in zero waste. Gary and Ruth Abbey have worked together on a number of projects. Ruth came out to Massachusetts 2 years ago, and we gave a presentation at a DEP conference about zero waste. And I think you'll see some of the flavor of that in terms of where the Massachusetts policy is today and where it's looking to head. In some cases, you may think slowly, but nonetheless, it is moving in that direction. What are the drivers? I'm going to kind of move through this quickly so I don't repeat a lot of what Gary said. So I'm really going to try and just get some of the Massachusetts focus issues out in terms of where we are in this state. Because I think that's really where we're going to go with Northampton is, in part defined by what the policies and regulations are that you're living under here in Massachusetts. But in terms of the key drivers, obviously, it's climate impact, sustainability, and getting beyond 70% diversion. Massachusetts has had a master plan since 1990. And it is a target. The current plan is a 70% diversion rate. We're actually not doing all that bad in terms of meeting that diversion rate. But the next step, and the state is looking at that next step now in terms of, there are hearings actually coming up over the course of the next couple of months in terms of moving that solid waste master plan forward. So we encourage all of you to take a look at that as well. Massachusetts, the preferred hierarchy has been reduce, reuse, recycle from place for generation. Our reduction rate has increased from the mid-teens at the start of the planning period to 60% in 2006. Now, I should point out that includes C&D, that includes commercial. I mean, that's an overall. It also includes source reduction. There is a mechanism for taking into account things that you can't measure, namely that it wasn't produced in the first place. And the emphasis has broadened from end-of-pipe core programs into looking at things like organics, commercial sector recycling, manufacturer responsibility, and that is an area where there's obviously a lot of room to grow. And pay-as-you-throw programs, which are really sending the price signal to the individual. In terms of Massachusetts, that's grown from 94 communities to 122 in 2007. And I think I know I think it's safe to say that we're all becoming more familiar with our trash. And that's part of what this is about, is we're going to get a lot closer to it before we're done.
Sean, I just wanted to jump in. Maybe everybody knows this, but C&D is construction and demolition debris. Maybe, I don't know if anybody mentioned that.
What's HDR?
HDR, it's a consulting firm, an engineering and management consulting firm. We are approximately 6,000 people. We're ranked #1 in Engineering News Record. It actually stands for Henningsen, Durham, and Richards, who were the 3 founders in 1917. In terms of as I mentioned, the state master plan is under a revision process. It's probably going to be a 6-month or more process. But again, it is something that is happening, and I encourage folks to participate in that. There are public hearings coming up around the state over the course of the next couple of months.
Can't hear you.
Sorry. Maybe we could turn, this doesn't help at all. All right, I'm just going to have to speak up. This you've seen. What is the issue? Part of it is the downstream waste. And, we're looking here from a municipal standpoint. What are you dealing with? It's what you put out at the curb. But before it gets there, you have this 71 times that upstream. And zero waste has to look at that as well, and that's part of the process. And there are some ways of doing that, and you as a citizen can have a role in that in terms of encouraging things like extended producer responsibility, in terms of how you purchase things, your own purchase decisions. It's another way of sending that signal. We all know that where it comes from. In terms of local solid waste management programs, you're primarily, again, looking at downstream waste. Upstream, you have all of these issues: mining, drilling, building, transporting, consuming. Downstream, it's what you do, which is reduce, reuse, recycle, process, disposal, and post-disposal. And I think, again, when we talk about zero waste in the context of as we're looking at it, probably the one area where we differ is in the issue of recovery of energy from the material as being a resource that it should not go to waste. And I think that really is the heart of the difference between what we look at and some of the things that Gary is looking at as well. And that's open for discussion and debate. Downstream, it's to ensure the highest and best use of the products, reuse the products in packaging, retaining their original form and function, recycle, compost, and convert materials that are not reduced or reused, and manage the residuals. Again, it is a goal. 0 defects, 0 accidents, 0 waste. Those are goals, and programs are put in place to achieve those goals. It goes beyond the end-of-line strategy, the end-of-pipe strategies. I mean, we've seen that movement in the Massachusetts Solid Waste Master Plan. We see that movement in terms of how, in implementing zero waste programs, it really needs to look and take a systemic view that reaches all the way back to the time that people sit around the table and decide how to design a product. Maximizes recycling and composting, reduces consumption, and as I said, designs waste out of the system. Reduce, reuse, recycle, process, convert. These are pieces of a zero waste initiative. You can see that it really looks across the entire waste stream, the materials, and looks at them on an individual basis. We look at, making it as convenient as trash, available to all generators, organics diversion, C and D diversion, zero waste infrastructure, and residuals waste management. Again, part of the piece of the puzzle is what do you do with what is left over? And we're talking, a change that may take a generation. It may take longer. And in that transition period, you need to have in place a system that deals with what comes out of the system. Trash, I look at trash as it's like the tide. It comes in every day, and you have to be in a position to deal with it. I want to talk now, turn it back to Alan and describe some of the things about, as you move to zero waste, what are you doing with some of the technologies and approaches to managing materials that you can't reduce, reuse?
Thank you, Sean. Actually, could you work the,
Okay.
that way I won't go
Excuse me.
through the slides too quickly. Maybe you want me to. Next slide, Sean. I'm first going to talk about, and probably fairly briefly, some of the established technologies. I'm not sure how much the group is familiar with all of them, but I did want to talk about material recovery facilities, composting, and then waste-to-energy facilities. Next slide. A clean material recovery facility is one that takes source-separated recyclables and then separates it into saleable commodities, paper, metals, glass, plastics. You could pick up the recyclables either as a single stream, meaning all the recyclables together in one bin, or you can separate out paper and then have a mixed bin for other materials, or as you do here in Northampton, you can bring it to a drop-off center and then separate it at the center for various uses. Here in Massachusetts, as Gary pointed out, we have the bottle bill, so a lot of our cans and our glass is being recycled through the deposit system within the state. Here, your recyclables, what's brought to your drop-off center, what is mostly the recyclables that are picked up at the curb are going to the Springfield MRF. There's a picture of that on the slide. On the lower right-hand corner is a little bit of a graphic of where our recyclables are going. Newspapers is about 89% of it, and it goes down the list in terms of what we are currently recycling in this country. Next slide. A dirty MRF is a processing facility that involves screening and sorting, but it's taking mixed municipal waste. It's what sometimes is being called black bag these days. It's the stuff that you put out that your garbage truck picks up. It could be prior to any recycling of source separated material or after recycling to try and get out some additional components. It's mainly called dirty because it's dealing with mixed municipal waste as opposed to an indication of how environmentally unsound or sound it may be. But it does involve potentially manual sorting as well as machine sorting. The pictures show one of the machines, a disc screen, and then a manual sorting station. What you end up with at dirty MRF is you end up with a large portion of residuals. Those residuals are things that are not separated for recycling as a particular product, can then be used in a processing system, either a composting facility, a combustion facility, or some of the other technologies I'm going to be talking about. Many of the other emerging technologies require this type of processing before you can go ahead and use them. Some of the general observations about clean and dirty MRFs and sort of a comparison is that dirty MRFs, there's actually been a fair amount of experience going back to the 70s and 80s with some limited success. Not all of them have worked, many have been shut down. A lot of the ones that have kept going are the ones that have a processing after you do the recycling or recovering the metals and recovering paper and so forth. Particularly refuse-derived fuel, which has incineration at the back of it. The closest one is probably CMAS. There's also one in Hartford, which is not too far from here. Both of those have material or dirty MRFs in front of a system, and then they have combustion afterwards. Next slide. Composting. What you can compost is the organic fraction of the waste stream, which includes food waste, yard waste, paper products, and so forth. And you can either separate it out or, again, have a mixed waste processing facility with composting. The pictures on the top left, that's a static pile, picture of a static pile, similar to the process that is being done now at the Glendale Landfill here in Northampton. Just to the right of that's a windrow system where you do more turning of the organic material. And this is a very natural process when you go through composting. It's just degradation of organic material. You end up with a humus product which has value, but one of the key things is the contaminants that might be in the compost, and it may limit its use. And a lot of places you're finding the compost that's being generated is being used for landfill cover because it doesn't have a good market. The middle picture is actually a food waste composting facility that HDR designed at Rikers Island at the prison in New York. And there are very little, isn't that much food waste processing going on. It works very good with vegetative material. It has some problems with grease and fats from meats and so forth. But at Rikers Island, we sort of have a population that sort of has no place else to go, and they get food every day. And so we have a lot of food waste there, so it was a nice solution for that particular setting. And then in the bottom picture is a picture of the Nantucket mixed waste composting facility using a Bedminster process. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that in the United States, this is based on a survey that's done by BioCycle, there are 13 mixed waste processing facilities in the United States, 2 of them here in Massachusetts. I think I went over one of those 2, there are over 200 composting operations in Massachusetts. 2 of them are mixed waste processing. It's doable, it is an established technology, but it has had limited success, and how you separate, how you get your compostable material is very important in how successful that process might be. Next slide is waste energy. I sort of struggled with what to call this. A lot of people are calling this now advanced thermal recycling. In fact, HDR has done that in a number of presentations. It's called that in Europe and a lot of different places. And then a lot of people refer this as straight incineration. It is not incineration. Incineration is an old process. This is a power plant. It's highly controlled, and it is producing steam and electricity. I chose waste energy to try and be somewhat even-handed in the presentation here. A key point is that you do get energy production. You get 90% volume reduction in the waste stream in terms of saving on landfill capacity and usage. And in Massachusetts, each year over 3 million tons of the waste generated in the Commonwealth is currently going to 7 waste energy facilities. And it's also the predominant method of waste management in both Europe and Asia. Next slide. Somewhere between 8 and 15% of the waste in the United States is currently being processed through a waste energy facility. In Europe, there are over 400 waste energy plants, and it varies by country on the percentage. And in Japan, there are over 100 waste energy facilities, and 70 to 80% of the waste stream is processed through a waste energy facility. I spent a couple of weeks in Japan studying their recycling and solid waste management practices. This was a number of years ago, and so I had a chance firsthand to see what they're doing. I had an interpreter with me, and I had translators, so I was actually getting Japanese documents and having them translated for me. So that when you look at Japan and you look at and I think Gary mentioned it, their objective is 0 waste to the landfill. And they're pretty close to getting there. But it's done with 70, 80% of the waste being combusted. Next slide. I'll talk about some of the new developments that are going on at landfills. I'm not a landfill expert, but I just want to go through this because it is an option that is being done in a number of places in the United States. In essence, a landfill, what happens at a landfill, the waste gets put into the landfill and it degrades, and it degrades over a long period of time the way we manage our landfills today. What a bioreactor landfill tries to do is it tries to speed up that degradation process in a controlled manner so that you can get, it's either aerobic, meaning with air, or anaerobic, without air, without or limited air, digestion of the waste. It does a number of things. One, you can control and generate more gas for reuse. Secondly, you basically, with the decomposition, you increase the capacity of your landfill, you increase the extended life of the landfill, which is the primary reason why people are starting to look at going to bioreactors at a landfill. And if you design it properly, you can capture the gases, you can recycle the leachate through the bioreactor, and you, from an environmental point of view, it may be an advancement that we're seeing in landfill designs. The next slide just shows some of the advantages of doing a bioreactor landfill as opposed to a traditional sanitary landfill. And then the next slide shows some of the places in the United States where bioreactors are starting to be designed and actually implemented. I'm now going to talk about some of the emerging technologies. You may have read about these, you may have seen some things on the internet, and I just wanted to go through what we are seeing as a company in terms of the experience with these emerging technologies. I'll first talk about in-vessel anaerobic digestion, autoclaving, gasification, and then plasma arc gasification, which is a form of gasification, but it's getting a lot of press, so we separated that out. Why do we want to consider emerging technologies, or why does any community want to consider it? It's partly because they're looking for greater diversion goals. This concept of zero waste, waste no resources. So they're looking at ways of trying to convert solid waste into usable products. There's landfill capacity needs. There's limited landfill capacity in the United States, and actually I think the number is like 85% of the landfill capacity in the United States is owned by 2 companies. It's not a very competitive marketplace right now. And many communities, particularly when they have to travel long distances to the landfills, Boston's going out by rail now, New York's going out by rail now, Los Angeles is taking their waste out by rail now. They're going hundreds of miles. It's getting more and more expensive. So the more you can reduce, reuse, recycle, convert, the less you have to transport, which has a global warming impact. In some communities, they're getting some of these companies that are trying to promote the emerging technologies will actually come and build it for you as a pilot program, because they need to show they can demonstrate that it works. And if they can demonstrate it works, then you can maybe go to full scale. And so a lot of larger communities are doing this because they can take a small portion of the waste stream and use it as a demonstration program. I'll get into some of the issues relative to Northampton in terms of being able to do that. But it is possible, particularly in emerging technology, to get someone else at least pay for part of it, if not all of it. A lot of what I'm going to present to you is based off of 3 international tours that HDR has conducted over the last 5 years. The people that went on these tours were our engineers and some of our planners. We not only just went there and looked at the marketing sales pitch that people were giving, we actually crawled into these systems. We asked our engineers how it was performing. We asked for data. We looked at the environmental impacts of the different technologies, and we were getting a pretty good feel for what's been going on throughout the world with these emerging technologies. Next slide. This shows some of the countries that we visited on these tours. We're not done. We're going to be doing more. And in some particular case, we're going to revisit some places where they haven't quite gotten up to commercial operations yet. We want to see what happens when they get up to it. Next slide. In-vessel anaerobic digestion. This is, if you talk about differences in technologies, composting is basically an aerobic process where the waste is being digested with oxygen. And if you have an oxygen limiting digestion process, it's anaerobic. So what you have with anaerobic is that you create an environment where the waste can degrade more rapidly in the absence of oxygen, and you can create what's called a biogas. The biogas is typically methane with some CO2 and water. That biogas can be run through a boiler, it can be burned to produce steam, to produce power. It can be run through a gas turbine, or it can be, or an engine, also to produce electricity. And you're actually doing some of this at your landfill with the methane recovery that you're doing there. You're producing power at your landfill now. But here what you're doing is you're going to create, you build these vessels, you put the waste in it, you control the environment, and you develop biogas. About 50% of what you put in there, however, comes out as a digestate, which is basically a product which can then be potentially composted, combusted, and so forth. But the actual anaerobic digestion to gas only gets you about a 50% reduction. Some of the general observations we've seen is that in Europe, the plants that are using anaerobic digestion are using only a portion of the waste stream. It's been green waste, it's been some are taking food waste, it's not mixed municipal waste. There's a couple of plants that are under construction which are designed to try and handle mixed municipal solid waste, but they're trying to do a lot, they have to do a lot of processing. Basically, you need a dirty MRF in front of it to separate out the organics, and then you put the organics into the anaerobic digestion process. Potential negative impacts of the process are odors, increased speed, okay. I started this morning at 3 in the morning in Spokane, Washington, so.
Alan's about halfway through, so
Right.
I'm just thinking if we could aim to be done by 9, because we want to make
That's-
sure, right, we want, let me just get a feel, excuse me. How many of you expect that you will have questions or comments on what you've seen so far? Okay. Yeah, so I don't know, Alan.
Okay, no, I'll speed it up because they can probably read faster than I can talk. Okay, just to sum up on the anaerobic digestion, if you go to the next slide, there are environmental issues there that have to be addressed. There's potentially economic issues because it is right now a fairly expensive process, and you have to deal with what's left over after anaerobic digestion, and that means that you're going to have some additional processing beyond that to handle the residual or have a landfill to dispose of it. Gasification. Gasification is a thermal process, just as waste energy was a thermal process. Again, the difference is one is done with a lot of oxygen, so you get a fire, and the other one is done with limited oxygen, so you don't get a fire. What you do is you create a syngas. Syngas is mostly carbon monoxide and hydrogen. That syngas, just like the biogas, can be used in a number of different ways to produce power or energy, or it may be able to be cleaned up, and same with the biogas, and be used in a pipeline. Some variations of gasification are pyrolysis and plasma arc. But you get a lot of other products, just like with anaerobic digestion, you have a lot of stuff that's left over, and that's oftentimes called a char. What you end up with, like a gasification of wood, for example, you end up with charcoal. And gasification has been used in a lot of industrial processes, gasification of coal. It has not been used a whole lot in terms of with municipal solid waste. We did not find, next slide, we did not find it very prevalent in Europe. The most prevalent country that uses gasification is Japan. They have a couple of commercial scale facilities, but they seek a uniform feedstock. Again, one of the problems with a lot of these emerging technologies is that they seem to work on uniform feedstocks. When you have mixed waste, they don't work that well. Then you still have a portion of the waste stream that is left over as residual or ash that needs to be disposed of. We expect with gasification, we don't have a lot of information on the environmental impacts, but we expect the air emissions probably to be similar to what you get with the advanced waste energy facilities in terms of air emissions. And we need basically we need better information before we'll be able to give a clear indication of whether this is going to be suitable here in the United States. It is relatively expensive. Japan's willing to pay for it, again, because they're trying to keep everything they can away from them. They don't have any land to put any waste into, so therefore they want to get rid of it all. Plasma arc, next slide. It's been used in Japan, in some cases, basically to take ash from the incineration and even reduce it further. In essence, it's gasification at extremely high temperatures, and the potential for that is you can actually possibly generate a lot more electricity, maybe a lot more efficient in generating power. Another potential advantage of it is that you may be able to do it, convert more, get rid of more of the municipal solid waste, or reduce it further and end up with less ash. I guess the general observations on plasma arc is that we went to the facility in Ottawa, Canada. They haven't operated it continuously. They haven't been able to show reliability yet. It's still in startup. This is one of those facilities we're going to have to go back and take a look at. So right now there is no demonstrated commercial facility using plasma arc. Very quickly I go through autoclave. Autoclave is used for medical waste, spatial sterilization process, use steam and pressure. The sort of the advantage for solid waste or organics is that you develop a cellulosic product that could be converted through hydrolysis into an ethanol type of product. Hydrolysis being a chemical process using enzymes and acids to do conversion. You also can do some sterilization, and what we're looking at in next slide, there have been 3 demonstration projects in Salinas Valley, California. HDR is helping Salinas Valley conduct a pilot scale on autoclave. Large-scale autoclave has not been practiced. It's batch fed. As you can see, there's 2 different autoclave chambers here. What we're trying to do is to figure out what the environmental impacts, what the cost impacts, what can you really recover, and what is the efficiency of the process. That's going to be a 2-year effort. So it has a lot of promise. If you look at the next slide, just as a lot of these emerging technologies have a lot of promise, we don't have, in many cases, commercially established operations where we can say we know it will work. In summary, I put together 2 summary slides. This sort of shows the attributes, the different technologies as you go through it, but describing the technology down in the left-hand column, what types of waste streams can be processed, whether it's proven or not, and then the economic results. And if you think of economics, here in Northampton, you're looking somewhere in the mid-60s in terms of dollars per ton that it costs at your landfill right now. Some of the things we looked at, you saw, were well over $100 a ton. And those were larger scale systems. You have a relatively small amount of waste, and I'll get into that a little bit later, what you would have to do to implement one of these. The next slide sort of shows a sort of a comparison from an environmental standpoint in terms of what we know today. I wanted to, if you look at energy, when it says net benefit, what that means is that a clean MRF does not produce energy. But there's indirect benefits because you're saving energy on the production of from virgin materials to produce the same products. So there is a net benefit on energy, and that's what that means as you go down that column. Then there are those technologies you're actually producing energy. And it's not clear on some of them whether it's a net production, because plasma arc takes a lot of energy within itself. Carbon footprint, which Sean will talk a little bit about. Looks like they all will have some net benefit relative to global warming issues. Water impacts and land use impacts. If you have more time, you can look at this at your convenience. But this is what we know today about the various technologies. Conclusions. I got a few more slides. Whoops, what happened?
That's not good.
Well, the basic conclusions on emerging technologies is that there's serious movement to greater diversion, that emerging conversion technologies are becoming more interesting for people to look at. Factual performance, emission, and cost information is difficult to obtain, and we're in the process of trying to get the best information we can. Pilot and demonstration projects are needed, and when proven feasible, emerging conversion technologies could be a very important part of any solid waste management program throughout the United States and also here in Northampton. Well, while he's putting that up, what I want to talk now is what you need to put together a processing facility, and how can you get one if you wanted to have one here in Northampton. Well, there are 6 basic aspects of any type of project of this nature. You need a reliable feedstock. In this case, it'd be waste or separated portions of the waste. You need a demonstrated technology. You need a suitable site for the facilities. You need energy and/or material markets. And if you produce electricity, we have the ability here to sell to the grid. You need a residuals and bypass waste landfill. Residuals being whatever the residuals out of the process. Bypass, machinery breaks down. Machinery has to be maintained. There's going to be periods of time when you can't process everything that's being put out the curb, so you need some place to put the what we call bypass waste. And finally, you need financing. Someone's going to have to pay to put together a processing facility. If you look at these particular aspects relative to Northampton, as Jim pointed out, not a lot of the waste that's going to landfill now is generated in Northampton. A lot of it's coming from other communities. In addition to that, you really don't control it because a lot of it's picked up by private companies at the curb. The only thing you control is what's brought at the drop-off center, and what's brought up at the drop-off center is voluntary in terms of people's participation. So if you really needed to do a processing facility, you'd have to find some way to either economically attract the waste or find some way of controlling it. Demonstrated technologies. There are some of the things we looked at in terms of composting, in terms of other things are possible. If you go outside of Northampton, like the Springfield Waste Energy Facility, a lot of communities go there. They're getting their waste converted to power. Suitable site, again, if it's located here in Northampton, you'd have to identify the site. Could be the landfill site. I already mentioned about energy markets, but the most important thing relative to anything you want to do is going to be how are you going to control the waste supply to make it possible for this thing to work economically and make sure that what you put in place will work when it's done. Some of the ways to make that happen, there are different ways of getting projects built. The traditional approach, the way most things are built in this country is the design, build, bid approach, where an engineer designs it, builder then builds it to specification, and then it's operated by the owner. Design, build, operate in the 80s, in the late 70s and early 80s, the reason we went to design, build, operate for solid waste processing facilities was because there was technical risk. What we're able to do is transfer that technical risk to the private sector. So design, build, operate is a way of getting the private sector to take some of the risk. As I mentioned before, with emerging technologies, you might get the private sector actually to finance a demonstration project. And then the last option here is they will finance it, design it, build it, operate it, and then transfer ownership back to you so that you end up owning the facility if you wanted to. Now Sean's going to talk a little bit about greenhouse gases and how solid waste management and global warming work.
Okay,
So Sean, if you could try to do it in about 5 minutes.
I'm actually less than that.
Less than that?
Yeah, I think we wanted to actually get opportunity and time for some questions. I think just really quickly, and these slides will be available on the DPW website. But it really just goes through that greenhouse gases are an issue, that waste is an important aspect of working to reduce the impact of greenhouse gases, that there are tools out there that can help you look at ways of making decisions that take into account greenhouse gases and carbon, and as part of the process that those would be things that we will be taking into account as we go through this effort to identify what makes the most sense for the community. So I'd rather than run through that, as I said, the slides will be up on the website. I do want to get a chance so folks can ask their questions, and I know we've already spent a lot of time. So I think at that, I turn it back to you, Jim.
Okay, great. Thanks, Don. Okay, so I think what we're going to do is, because of the time, we'll skip taking a formal break. If people need to use the restrooms, please go ahead and do so. So again, show of hands, how many people have a question? Actually, let me ask this. How many of you have a question for any of the presenters? Okay. And how many people have a comment to the presenters or to the Board of Public Works about the study? We have some. Okay, let's start off first with questions so we can get the information out there. If everybody could, if you have a question, we'll just do it sort of first come, first serve to come up to the mic here and ask your question. If you could try to make your question be as to the point and brief as possible so we can then get to the answers, that would be great. And Gary, where are you? There's Gary. Okay. And if you could just...
Gary sit up there too?
Yeah, Gary, why don't you go ahead up there? And if people with questions could say your name and just anything you want to say about your role in the community, that's helpful. And again, anybody who needs to leave, we have comment cards. There's index cards on the table over there. So feel free to fill one of those out and leave that with us if you can't stay any longer.
Mike Fedora from 238 Glendale Road. Gary, I got a couple of questions here. How long did the cities of California take to implement their zero waste concepts? You know, like say Oakland. I mean, that's a very large city, and I mean, we already see that 80% of our waste is commercial haulers. You know, we got a big problem there. How do they deal with that?
The question is, how long has it taken? They've just begun pursuing zero waste. Probably the furthest along is San Francisco, who was one of the first to really put serious attention to zero waste. But most of the major cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Jose are about 60 to 64% waste diversion. Most of them have adopted short-term goals of 70 to 75% diversion and zero by 2020 or 2025. So we're really at the beginning stages in the California cities. I think where there's longer time horizon is probably New Zealand, which has been going after it for longer. They basically had nothing going on, very little recycling going on before the zero waste movement. So they literally went from 0 to 60% in a couple of years by approaching it from a zero waste perspective. But they're still around there. So we do have examples of communities that have achieved over 80% and 90% diversion, but there's only a couple of those out there. So as far as how much communities have achieved, they're on the way. It's the businesses that are leading the way. That's why it's so important to understand that businesses achieving over 90%, many of them not landfilling anything for years, is the hallmark that shows us it's possible, and therefore it's only a question of how do we do that for the whole system on a community-wide basis. That needs to be worked out.
Thank you, but it's still the commercial hauling aspect of it, because there's how do you control that?
The question is, how do you deal with the situation where most of the waste is coming from private businesses, and many communities, I had that one list that talks about helping businesses be green, and I said communities are either asking their businesses, giving them incentives, or requiring them to do certain things on that list. And the mandatory recycling ordinances in central Vermont, in Austin, Texas, and San Diego are examples where they say you have to keep your recyclables separate from your waste. That's just part of running a business in those communities. Each community has figured out how to match up keeping it separate and then making sure haulers pick it up. In some places they require haulers to offer at least as much recycling service as garbage service, or they require haulers to charge no more than 50% of the garbage rate for recycling rate to get the price signals right. So even though the cost of service may be different than the rates charged, the point is, in your charging your rate, you're trying to communicate into the marketplace what you're trying to accomplish. And so in those communities, they charge a higher garbage rate and have a lower recycling rate. So like in San Francisco, they're able to go and tell every business, you can save money if you recycle more. And so a lot of this has to do with policies, new rules, new incentives, which everyone is experimenting with around the country. I did case studies in 2000 for the California Waste Board. There's two documents on their website that I'd urge you to take a look at called Incentives and Business Policies. And those highlight, as of then, a lot of the tools that different communities were experimenting with. And what zero waste is about is figuring out which tool works here given the particular politics, the particular investment by the private sector, the history, the traditions, the values of the community. And so that's what zero waste planning or options analysis is all about, trying to figure out of all these options how to apply it. But the key is of what you're asking about is it's in the new rules and the incentives. It's not just about facilities. It's not just about the landfill or the facility. It's how the stuff flows there, and there's rules. In New Zealand, I didn't want to drive on the right side of the road because the rule was you drive on the left. The rules are broken on commercial waste. The rules are not working. We're not getting that feedback into the system. And it has to do with both the producer responsibility, but even on just commercial waste flow. The system is broken. It's not working. It's not accomplishing what we have set as our public goals. So we need new rules or incentives to address that.
Oh, thank you very much, and thank you for coming here, and thank you, Sean and Alan, for doing this. Thank you.
And we'll try to, I know everybody has a lot to do, to ask here, so we'll try to keep things moving. If Sean, whoever the question's directed to, if someone else has something to add, please chime in. But let's try and get a bunch of the questions out there, and then we can circle back around as necessary. And as much as possible, if we can try and, even if you have multiple questions, ask one first, and let's get through everybody, and then we'll circle back. So, who's next? Question?
Hi, my name's Bob Aronson.
What's that?
The last two forums, people just lined up and waited their turn.
If you all want to stand up and do that, I would rather, if you want to sit, not make you stand. But do people want to stand up?
Yeah, it works. Yeah.
Whatever you all want to do.
Should we get in line too?
Yeah, I mean, everybody's going to have an opportunity to speak, so you don't have to stand up there in line, but that's up to you.
Sure. I'm used to lines. My name's Bob Aronson, 71 Sylvester Road, about a mile north of the present landfill.
Bob, speak up so we can hear you.
Okay. So my question was, and you kind of talked about it, was if you did any kind of additional system, and I know we're going to need, the floor is going to be a new landfill of in whatever iterations in to take care of the minimum reducible stream. And then if we add anything to it, it adds to our competitive risks because we don't control the feedstock coming in. But doesn't that competitive risk also exist for just the minimum floor that we're talking about building as well? In other words, if there's competitors out there that are at a race to the bottom and their costs are lower than our costs, they'll be able to lower the price sufficiently to draw that 80% of the private haulers away. Especially since the fuel price just dropped by what?
A lot.
A lot. So
Yeah.
the mileage doesn't even become important anymore either.
Yeah, I mean, the question, in case anyone heard, is that there's competitive pressures even with the landfill and the current fees that are charged landfill, and that's absolutely correct. But if you look at the options that are available here in Western Massachusetts and the distance that people have to travel, the market has sort of centered on I said around the $65 a ton. And what would happen is that you would have to then reduce it to if you wanted to bring in the other waste and keep the economics the same way, or not do it and just maintain the landfill and have an extended life for the landfill. But you're absolutely right. The economic pressures are both. But if you have an option which is $100 a ton, you're probably not going to attract anyone when you have a lot of fixed capital costs associated with what you're doing.
Yeah, but those costs, for some of our, like the place in Springfield that's presently doing trash to energy.
Right.
They bought it when? When did they implement that and roll out the program versus us with inflation and everything else?
Right. Well,
So the only thing working against them is that the price of energy went down, right? So they're not getting as much per ton, but they'll be able to leverage the value out of the trash by being in that marketplace already.
An existing plant, my understanding is they're fully subscribed right now. I think they're in the $85 ton range.
Yeah.
But it's also, when you bring in the transportation costs as well, the 65 is at the gate, then you have to take what does it cost to get to an alternative location. We're going to be looking at these things.
That's what I was going to ask next.
Yeah.
You're going to be looking at this stuff.
Right.
Okay, that's all I needed to know.
I'd just like to chime in that I don't think you have to assume that you have to provide landfill capacity. You could provide transfer capacity. The assumption of having to provide local capacity was in the 80s when there was a concern that there wasn't going to be disposal capacity available anywhere. And we were running out of landfill space. That was the driver for a lot of the programs of the 80s and 90s. That doesn't compute anymore with the regional haul. And although it seems counterintuitive, the haul distance can be hundreds and thousands of miles for waste and recyclables when you're looking at some of the equations. So you don't have to provide local disposal. You could provide a transfer station that transfers waste out at a higher cost, and then your reuse and recycling programs locally would be cheaper than that option.
Well, some of the Massachusetts schools, they have a policy in their master plan, you probably have read it, of zero import and zero export. So they have all these countervailing interests, kind of, so I don't know. It's a conundrum. Thank you.
I just want to add to that. I mean, when I talk you need a disposal capacity, it doesn't mean it has to be necessarily local either.
Right.
But you look at the alternatives and what's available.
Okay.
Hi, Melinda McCall from Ryan Road, and I just have a quick clarification question about one of the DPW signs said that 11% of the waste comes from out of town and 80% is commercial, but is how much of that commercial is from out of town as well? And is there some record, some sense of what that commercial waste is composed of? How much is recyclable?
Jim or Dave or maybe Ned?
Karen McQuillan, she's the city's municipal solid waste coordinator.
Yeah.
Difficult or impossible to quantify where all the waste is coming from. We did do a survey of all the haulers a couple of years ago to identify which towns were being either direct haul from transfer stations or routes of commercial haulers or roll-off haulers serving certain towns. And that's where we came up with the 43 communities that were in our waste shed. But to quantify how much is coming, what percentage is coming out of Northampton, it's, a truck will travel through 10 communities before it gets to the landfill. So, and you take 50,000 tons per year and, 100 transactions a day at the landfill, and I would say impossible to really estimate accurately.
Okay, next question.
Bob Moriarty. My wife has a house that borders a landfill. I've got a question mainly on California. These recovery sites, are there any on aquifers? I didn't notice on the aerial view any residents nearby. And the Monterey plant, is that a asphalt batching plant? And if it is, how much benzene's released in that?
The questions were about resource recovery parks in California. There's a variety of them that have been, that I documented again in 2000, that I was pulling those slides from. The Davis Street transfer station owned and operated by Waste Management, Inc. Is probably the one that's closest to residents. That's probably I'm not real familiar with that area, probably within a half mile to a mile of that. Monterey is way
None of
out.
them abut nobody's right at the border with the land, with the facilities.
Not for that particular one, for the Urban Ore Resource Recovery Park in Berkeley. It's in a commercial zone.
Yeah, looks like their own industrial parks from what
right.
the aerial view showed.
Exactly. The other question you asked was was that an asphalt batching plant?
Yeah,
No,
you understand that when they take and recycle asphalt.
No, this is a C&D processing, basically a grinder, a grinding
It just
operation.
pulverizes it and then hauls it somewhere else to get cooked.
Right.
Okay.
And Gary, the other question was whether any of those facilities were over aquifers.
That I don't know. I don't know that.
Thank you.
Hi, Jesus Leyland. Just gonna ask one question because I know everybody else wants to ask a bunch. This is for you. Do you have to have a certain like minimum size of a defined region in order to implement like a zero waste plan, or can you do it at a very small level? I mean,
The question is there a minimum size for a zero waste plan? And I'd say no. There's, I believe there's no economies of scale. You do different things at different sizes. You can't big burners, major capital-intensive facilities in small regions. You don't have enough material flow to justify all the expenditures. So you do different things. The smaller the facility, you don't need the capital-intensive equipment to sort it out. You can ask for through policies and incentives for things to come more clean and source separated, so you don't need to pull it apart because it's already come that way from the public or from the businesses. So we've worked on zero waste plans in population 10,000 Telluride, 30,000 Del Norte County. A lot of the communities in New Zealand are really small. It's not a question of size, you do different things, but remember it's policies, programs, and facilities. It's a combination of all three of those, looking upstream and downstream, that are a key part of it.
Can you say anything, or either Sean or Alan, when you're talking about upstream and downstream and the size, about how you would address the differing roles of local government versus federal government? And when you talk about extended producer responsibility, can you implement those at those smaller scales, and how might you do that?
Yeah, one of my favorite things that you can do tomorrow at the local level for producer responsibility, for example, is put together guides on your website, or a publication like Ottawa, Ontario did, where you highlight where to take cell phones, medication, oil filters, car batteries. All of these are businesses that have agreed to voluntarily take back from people that bring it to their businesses those products that are listed in here. So it's free advertising from the public for the business. It gives the businesses customer loyalty. It provides an alternative funding source for local governments to get it done, because they're not involved except printing or putting on the website the information. So there are things that local governments can do. The California Product Stewardship Council, CPSC.org, has a list of local government ordinances that a lot of local governments are adopting to move into having businesses take responsibility, either banning products, banning plastic bags, and styrofoam takeout containers are the issues du jour that people are focused on because of a variety of reasons. So those bans are something that can be done locally, which is part of an accountability thing. That's something you've done a lot about in Massachusetts with bans. So you could do more of those, but you could also get take-back systems going like this, while you also advocate for changing the system at the state and national level, which is where the system is really broken and really needs to be fixed.
Yeah, I think just in terms of, on each legislative calendar in the Commonwealth, extended producer responsibility in some shape or form are among the bills that are discussed at length before the various committees. So there is absolutely that opportunity, and it's important to make your voice heard because that's the democratic process, and if they don't hear it, then it doesn't happen.
Do you know how many states currently have extended producer responsibility that they passed through the legislative process?
Well, there's various, industry-specific forms. I mean, Massachusetts has some producer responsibility legislation targeting mercury products, for example. So I think it's probably around a dozen that I'm aware of.
Yeah, I would say dozens of states have different types of producer responsibility, so it's just a question of building on each other's initiatives.
All right, next.
Hi, I'm Mary Cerez. I've been writing a series of articles on the proposed Northampton landfill expansion for the Valley Advocate, our alternative weekly. And I'm afraid that at this point in my life, the landfill expansion has become kind of an art project.
Scrapture.
I have a song I'd like to deliver, if anybody wouldn't mind. Song? All right, 3, 2. It's about money. In the old school way. Play a song.
She lives and breathes and eats it.
The landfill.
Now she's dreaming and writing songs about it.
Taking compost. Ha! I say what's the use, because as long as we be making it, there's gotta be a place to be taking it. So use it just once and throw it away. Consume, consume, it's the American way, we're all going. Hey, where are we going? Going. Said, no. Driving on down Old Glendale Road, leave spring sagging, it's a heavy load. Well, I'll be taking it to the landfill, it's got nowhere else to go. Yeah.
Now there'd be entertainment.
Well, thank you for the musical diversion. We're going to continue with questions. Please don't ask what key they played in or anything related to that. It's been some really good questions. Still on questions. We've had some good questions, so let's keep that going. How many people still have questions left? Okay. Line up if you want, or again, you'll have your chance if you want to just rest. So go ahead, next question.
Okay, I'm David Starr. I manage a nonprofit here in town called Green Northampton. We educate people in Northampton about how to reduce their carbon footprint. I have a couple of questions. The first one is how you think a new cap-and-trade system will affect municipalities and their approach to landfills and solid waste disposal.
I think one of the things that we see as a potential is, and one of the reasons that we've been working with SWANA, which is the Solid Waste Association of North America, on taking the EPA WARM model and making it a little more user-friendly and applicable to help municipalities look at solid waste management decisions, is that I think that as Gary mentioned, some people say that it's 3%, it could be 30%. So it is I think absolutely an area where there's an opportunity. The issue is in a real sense, are you going to be into a cap and trade where you're regulated into addressing the carbon issue, or are you looking at it from the perspective of potentially selling carbon credits, which that is also a market?
Mm-hmm.
And there's absolutely creative tension around, if I'm regulated, then I won't be able to use it as a carbon credit. But in any case, I think with the emphasis being placed on and the importance of addressing carbon issues, that I think change is absolutely. I think we also have to recognize that given the economic situation as it stands now, I think the new administration, it's going to be interesting to see how quickly that moves forward. But I mean, Massachusetts, as part of RGGI, we've already moved forward in terms of the utility industry in monetizing carbon emissions. So.
Won't municipalities be competing with commercial interests in terms of those carbon credits?
This is some of the classic issues about public-private partnerships. I mean, we saw that when you had renewable energy credits coming off of renewable power plants. Who owned those? And that was lawyers spent a lot of time sorting that out.
That's one of the biggest issues for cap and trade. Do we wait, not regulate, and wait to get this cash cow that's going to come down to fund everything, or do we keep moving and deal with things once it's all figured out? I lean towards keep moving, and there's plenty of things to regulate or not regulate. There's a lot of stuff to be done. There's lots of ways of getting to zero waste. Don't wait for cap and trade. There's some interesting proposals. Who gets the benefit is one of the biggest issues that's going to be really thorny and take a long time to deal with. One of the best ideas I heard recently is nationally there be a pool that is for funding of local government initiatives based on the societal benefits that are understood even without tracking community by community what that would be, and that would be like a block grant program funded nationally to communities on a population-based or project-based approach.
What we've done at Green Northampton is we've assigned an environmental theme to each month of the year. This happens to be Zero Trash Month, just coincidentally. What I'm noticing, we have zero trash programs started in all of the public schools and actually in private schools in Northampton as well. And I'm just wondering, in terms of zero trash, how much, if there's a formula for how much of the budget needs to go to education of citizens to get people. I mean, you can talk about the mottos that we have of reduce, reuse, and recycle. But the truth is there's a lot of education that needs to happen. I mean, one of my frustrations currently with recycling in, well, just anywhere really, is nobody really knows exactly what's recyclable and what isn't. There's a lot of confusion. If there are 50 people in this room, I'm sure we could get 50 different answers about specifics. So I see education as a very important part of that, and I'm not sure that's a lot of what you guys talked about tonight about how important education is in terms of affecting change. And the other thing I guess I'd like to hear about is composting. You know, we do have yard waste compost in Northampton. We don't have food waste composting. I mean, I've read all kinds of figures about food waste being up to 50% of a place like Northampton's waste stream. And it just seems like if we're talking about possibly applying for a license to expand the landfill, that we have a responsibility as a community to first reduce our waste stream before we look to expand the amount of space that we need to accommodate that waste stream.
On the education, I don't have the number off the top of my head. In the LA Zero Waste Plan, changing the culture is one of the 6 or 7 key messages that came out of a year-long stakeholder process. Getting celebrities involved, getting mass media, getting electronic tools, all sorts of things. Most of the zero waste plans have a lot of discussion about outreach and education. As far as a dollar figure, a couple dollars per household is what I've heard. Harvey Gershman talked at the National Recycling Coalition a couple of years ago about for just general recycling messages.
And then my last question would be whether or not there's any sort of formula about enforcement of recycling. Because I feel like without some sort of enforcement, whether it's financial penalty or some sort of checks and balances system, you're going to have a very difficult time of having people comply, not just in Northampton, but in the 16 other communities that send their garbage here to Northampton.
Right. Enforcement of bans, you may have some good examples of in Massachusetts. In San Diego, their mandatory recycling ordinance, they had very little problems with enforcing. The mandatory recycling ordinance was implemented by the county, asking who owned the landfills, asking the cities that use the landfills, you must adopt a mandatory source separation ordinance in order to continue to use the landfill. Similar to what I heard Jim talk about, or someone mentioned earlier, your requirements for other cities using your landfill. There's that type of enforcement tool. So you look for how to make it as simple and easy. I don't know about the bans.
Massachusetts uses waste bans as one of its regulatory tools, banning materials from disposal.
So how do you enforce that?
Well, one of the things, if you look over the last probably 5 years in terms of DEP's, budget and focus in those years when there has been funding, probably in the last year or so, one of the things that has been high on their priority list was getting more people out into the field, inspectors to visit facilities, and I know that's part of their initiatives, is to expand that. So I think, they fully understand as well that it is a combination of carrot and sticks.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the point is that there's a lot of mandatory recycling ordinances, but I think your question gets, how do you make sure people and businesses are actually doing recycling? And I only know of one place where they actually had recycling police. And they tried to
West Orange, New Jersey?
No, I was thinking New York City. But that's
Springfield's doing it now.
Part?
Springfield's enforcing recycling fines.
Yeah, but I mean, that is part of a program, but the incentive programs, I come from an economist point of view, and I like the carrot more than the stick. And And the incentive programs right now, for example, you can put out your recyclables, at least bring them to the drop-off center, and it doesn't cost you anything, or it costs you to put the black bag someplace.
Okay, thank you.
And I know we have a lot of people left to go, so I would ask everybody please to, for now, keep it to one question. As we have time, you can come back with questions, but some people may have to leave, so I'm going to start to really hold you to one question, if that's okay with everybody, so everybody gets at least a chance to come up.
Hi, I'm Lil Fedora, and I live at 238 Glendale Road. I have a statement and then a question. The city of Northampton, as I see it, should really set the goal and the standard to take the lead for the cities to move to the zero waste. You know, we are a sustainable city model. We should be that way. And when the current landfill right now is being driven by tonnages, to create and get this revenue. So my question is, how do we make zero waste attractive when there's just money hanging out there?
You look at the cash flow and change it. When I go into a community to do a zero waste plan, I ask what their budget is for garbage, and I say that's my zero waste budget. You're just spending the stuff in the wrong places, and you got to change the rates, you got to change the fees, you adjust everything so it's all reinforcing doing that. How to do it right here, I don't know. One example would be instead of getting $500,000 net revenue from a landfill activity, you might set up the resource recovery park on the landfill to get $500,000 of revenue from resource recovery park activities and transfer functions. That would be one way that you could do it. You could have fees on hauling, charge waste fees on hauling services. In San Jose, they charge 58% of every dollar goes to the city. That goes partly to the general fund and partly for recycling programs. So there, you can do, there's a lot of different ways of structuring fees, taxes, rates, and systems to have the same cash flowing in the system, only for the stuff you want it to flow to.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Joe Fallows. I live off of Route 66. Thank you for your great presentations this evening. I thought they were very interesting. I have a question for you as it relates to composting. I had the fortune of the opportunity to work on compostable biodegradable polymers and help commercialize those in the early 90s. We tried very hard to replace the elements in the fast food industry's waste stream, namely cutlery, drink lids, and straws, with polymerized starches, which is a fancy way of saying pasta noodles. We were successful at creating them. We actually did some composting studies with Ben & Jerry's and their festivals and showed that yes, it did compost, replacing the spoons and the cups that were traditionally plastic with these cups of noodles, if you will. It worked, and we tried approaching several of the fast food industry manufacturers. They were on board with it except for one fact, and that was that it was just not cost effective. We couldn't be competitive with the existing styrenes that were used in those days. Now, 15 years later, we're on the cusp. The polymers have been increased, the performance is great, the costs have come down, and sometime next year you'll see some of the fast food industry starting to channel their waste streams into composting. My question to you is, are we hiding, are we fooling ourselves thinking that this is going to be a great composting diversion, getting it out of the landfill, if we can't use that waste stream after it's composted for anything other than capping landfills?
On the question of using organics to just cap the landfill, that's called alternative daily cover, ADC. California has a horrendous problem having allowed that to count for diversion, for waste diversion. And there are many cities that have said, no, you cannot do that as a policy. And I support that approach, that it's contrary to everything you've told the public you're doing, is getting this stuff out of the landfill to put it back in. No, I'm sorry, that doesn't compute. and so what you should be developing is clean, source-separated compost programs for yard trimmings, food scraps, food contaminated paper, and having that create a quality product that can be used for getting back to the soil. We have a huge topsoil problem in this country as well. We're losing our topsoil, which is another part of the equation. We've got to put the half of our waste stream that's organics together with the half of our soil loss and get the organics back to the soil.
Yeah, they're basically two issues, and I sort of agree with a lot of what Gary said. The first is getting clean compostable material, because part of the problem when you do mixed waste composting, you're going to get heavy metals, you're going to get contaminants in there, which you can't use for environmental reasons in some applications. And then there's the market issue. No matter how clean it is, if you don't have the ability for someone to take it away and use it, now a lot of times you have to give it away, and that's that's done with a lot of communities. You can come to the compost pile, you can take what you need for your a lot of horticultural use and so forth. So getting clean compost and finding outlets for it is a key thing. When it's not clean, you may have no choice, and you're substituting that for other cover material at a landfill. But I agree, it's not the best use for it, but it's what's happening in a lot of places.
Great answers, thank you.
I guess this sort of starts our comment question period. And I want to start.
Before you do dive in, can I just ask, were there any questions remaining?
I have some.
Okay, yeah, go ahead. Let's just finish out the questions first.
Well, I have questions, but I was going to comment first. But it's all right. She's a board member. Are you doing the board member at the same time?
Well, I don't know if we set aside time for questions for board members.
Yes, since it is going later, I think we should mix.
If you have a question, good. Okay, I'll go. My name's Susan DiMaria. I'm on the Board of Public Works. I actually have more than one question. I'll use two questions. One is about the resource recovery parks, which I think is a great idea, and I like the idea of zero waste. But I'm wondering what your suggestion would be, because until we get from 75 to zero waste, what would be your suggestion as to the residual waste after we go through the resource recovery park? What would you do for that?
Not having looked at your situation, I wouldn't say for sure, but the one option I've been saying that I want to make clear you consider is transfer. The fundamental assumption of no export-import that is in the master plan was an assumption based on a reality of the 80s that no longer exists. That needs to be understood and evaluated.
To somebody else's backyard, to transfer it to someone else's backyard, is that the idea?
My point is not that you want to transfer to someone else's backyard, but if we focus on focusing on landfills locally, ironically, we're undermining the very thing we really want to have happen, which is reuse, recycling, and composting. So let the market determine what the value of that is. Let the communities that want to take this in for host fees determine what host fees to charge. And let that market price go wherever it wants to, and then reuse, recycling, and composting will look better. That's my point. And it's a different reality today than when the fundamental assumption of don't import, export was adopted. That's what I'm saying.
And then my other quick question is the waste to energy. What are the residuals to that, and any emissions, or what are the negative side effects to it?
There's first of all, there's an ash, both bottom ash and fly ash. The principal approach most waste energy facilities use in the U.S. is to combine the two. It passes the toxicity test, and it can be disposed of in a landfill or an ash landfill. It's when it goes into the landfill, the testing that has been done, it's a fairly benign, not a lot of leachate. I mean, it's a good way of disposing of it. In a lot of places, Europe and Japan, they separate the fly ash and the bottom ash, and the bottom ash goes to a landfill, and the fly ash goes to a hazardous waste facility. As far as emissions are concerned, there are significant emissions, but they are controlled, highly controlled. In terms of power generation, waste energy facilities are the most controlled, environmentally controlled power plants in the U.S.
Thank you all for coming tonight. It's really appreciated.
So anyway, thank you very much for coming. I think this has been a long-needed conversation in this community is about some options as opposed to just landfilling. This has been a very contentious issue in this city, and it started in 2006 when our planning department created a water supply protection district and wrote the ordinance to exempt the landfill if the special permit goes through. It will be the first time that that will happen in the entire Commonwealth if the Board of Public Works and the City Council votes yes on the special permit. From Boston to the Berkshires, landfills are banned from water supply protection districts. So after that happened, the gag order was put on the city councilors. That was also a first. The mayor hired Attorney Michael Pill and Janet Shepard, Attorney Janet Shepard, the city attorney, cooperated and put a gag order on the city councilors 8 months ago and told them because they're going to be in a semi-judicial role, they may not talk about the proposed landfill expansion with any of the residents. And then last week or 2 weeks ago, we got a new board member of the Board of Public Works who used to be on the Solid Waste Commission and voted yes for the landfill expansion back, I don't know, in 1999. And it wasn't put on the city council agenda. It was a last minute, and she was voted in and sort of slid in. And if you blinked your eye, you would have missed it. Okay, so that's a little bit of the history. So I agree we need new policies. I don't know if you've seen from the Massachusetts DEP website, they have their draft municipal solid waste plan, which is called Landfills Last. Okay, I'm sure you've seen it. Okay, so when the city originally applied for the site suitability and all that stuff, that was at the end of the Romney administration, and Commissioner Gullidge gave the city another precedent-setting waiver to put the landfill in a Zone 2 on top of the Barnes Aquifer, which provides water. It's a sole source aquifer for East Hampton, Southampton, Westfield, and Holyoke. So I don't believe that Commissioner Burt would do that under the Patrick administration. Also, before I get to my questions, the methane generator at the landfill. It only runs when the landfill is open because it is too loud. And the reason it's too loud, instead of being put in back of the landfill where the leachate treatment facility is, this big building that costs a few $1 million, it's not being used, by the way. Separate issue. And it abuts a property of a property owner, and it's too loud. It exceeds the noise levels. And there's been a big social, besides the contamination of the wetlands, the environmental issues going on, there's a real social injustice issue. I think you probably got that from the tone of the song, a real social injustice issue. This has become a sacrifice zone, okay, where people have been living with unreleased gas emissions, VOCs, and the odors that come with that for years, which is documented in the DEP files. So my question is, two questions. One is for Gary Liss and HDR, and the other one is for City Engineer Jim Laurila. For Jim, it's when you showed the slides, we're in FY09, fiscal year 09 right now. Started in beginning of July. But the slide showed how much we made in fiscal year 06. I'd like to know how much the city made in 07 and 08. And then for Gary Liss and HDR, I would like to know about curbside pickup, transfer station, and zero waste, a combination, and how that works with, do you have such a thing as when educating? There's been a lack of education in this community. We don't have a sort of like a volunteer solid waste committee where you could actually use citizens to educate people, so it wouldn't cost the city money. And so I was wondering, do you know of any instances where you have curbside pickup, transfer stations, and zero waste in place in one community? You don't have a landfill. Just so you know, there are 3 landfills other than the Northampton landfill in western Massachusetts within 20 miles, 2 within 15 miles, 1, Granby, just bought 90 acres to expand their landfill, just to give you a little perspective. Thank you.
Jim, do you want to respond first on the fiscal question, if you haven't?
No, I don't have the numbers. If I had the numbers, we would have presented them tonight.
So I don't know if people heard Jim was saying he would respond if he had the numbers, but they don't have the numbers for 07, 08.
We have the numbers for those years. We'll put them up on the website with everything else. It's just, that presentation was from a couple of years ago, and I just think he didn't update the slide.
Okay, so if people didn't hear, the mayor said those numbers are there, they will go up on the website.
They're on the city's website now in the budget that's posted on the city's website.
Okay, so they're on the city's website right now in the budget that's posted. Thank you.
Yeah, just in terms of the zero waste question and the communities that have zero waste programs, curbside collection and transfer, most of the communities that I know of that are doing zero waste don't have their own landfill. Part of the impetus for going to zero waste and diversion is because of the high cost of getting it to a landfill or an alternative disposal site. I guess that's the best I can answer your question, is that a lot of communities are transferring, and that is a predominant way when you have to go long distances, you want to transfer the waste.
The Del Norte Resource Recovery Park was a transfer station and the Resource Recovery Park for processing as much material as they could there. And that's because it was replacing their old landfill in town, and they shipped across to Oregon the residue. Burbank is one of the few communities that I know that's adopted zero waste, that has their own municipal landfill. They have a municipal recycling operation, and they have a contracted MRF on city land, a public-private partnership. So there's examples of all these different permutations that are out there. But as was just stated, in many cases it was zero waste was being pursued as an alternative to existing landfills or expanding new landfills or landfill controversies. LA, they're closing down Puente Hills in 2012. That's a political promise to the residents of that area. That's the big driver to LA to look at their options. And it was actually an option study, not a zero waste plan, but they started calling it SWIRP, Solid Waste Integrated Resources Program. And their first interviews, people said, "What's a SWIRP?" And they decided they needed a better name for what they were doing. So they searched the world with their PR folks, and they came up with zero waste was the best way of inspiring people and getting people involved in the umbrella of getting all these pieces in place.
Yeah, one of the slides that I put up there, where I had the 5 different things that you look at when you look at solid waste management planning, that there are trade-offs that every community has to make between how much they want to pay to manage their waste, what environmental impacts they're going to be, and there are local environmental impacts, there are regional environmental impacts, and there are global environmental impacts. And a lot of communities try and opt to solve a local problem and create a problem someplace else. Long distance transport is both costly and energy consumptive, as opposed to if you had a more regional option to go to. And there are other options here in Western Massachusetts, and there are other options beyond Massachusetts where you could transfer waste. The issue is, if you look, again, do you want to look at that environmentally from a more global point of view, and what's the best thing to do from an environmental standpoint, not just locally, and secondly, how much is it going to cost you relative to what you have in place now?
Yeah, one of the things, just real quick, as Gary indicated, the City of Los Angeles is doing a zero waste program. Part of the work that HDR has been involved in is also as a technology assessment. They are looking at an emerging technology pilot program as part of their overall solid waste management plan as well. So it does vary depending on the specific needs of the community and where they are and where they're trying to get to.
And I just want to ask Dave, actually, if you wouldn't mind saying a little bit, thinking about that first question that was asked about the revenue that has come into the city in the past. As I understand from discussions that we've had, that there's a recognition that that's what has happened in the past, but going forward is potentially a different situation, both with the landfill expansion or anything else, right? That assumptions about the past do not necessarily bear on the future.
Right. Well, I'm certainly not the best person to talk about this, but you're absolutely correct. The combination of revenues, the host community fee, pilot, and so on are there's no guarantee that that would continue. And in fact, of course, the future scenario that we may end up with in a few years may be nothing like what we're thinking of right now, and it's so hard to predict, of course, and we don't know what the competition is like either. So you're absolutely right, and maybe there's maybe Jim or someone else would like to speak about that, but yeah, it's true.
Okay. Yeah, Jim or anyone else in the city who wants to add to that? I think you put it pretty well, Dave, that its future is uncertain, as you were saying. All right, next question.
This is a comment, not a question. Alan, you had talked about anaerobic digestion and gasification, and that process also showed up in a Stantec report, or possibly it was in a RECO document. And if I understand this correctly, it would turn the landfill into a bioreactor, adding sludge from human waste to the toxic stew already extant at the landfill, and to cause that toxic stew to decompose faster and generate higher amounts of methane gas. Now, we know that methane gas, and Gary had talked about this, is 20 times as strong as a greenhouse gas as carbon dioxide, that 1 ton of garbage can produce 400 to 500 cubic yards of gas, of which 60% is methane, almost 40% carbon dioxide, talking about global warming. That gas creation process can continue for an average of 15 to 25 years and can be highly explosive in an anaerobic atmosphere. And we know the neighborhood is already suffering the impact of the methane gas. So I guess this is the part of the comment. I sincerely hope that DPW isn't thinking of going that route.
Okay, thank you.
I'd just like to clarify, anaerobic digestion is not necessarily paired with bioreactor. Bioreactor is one way of dealing with things. Anaerobic digestion is more often done separate from landfilling. A bioreactor can be operated anaerobically, which would anaerobically digest. You're correct. But when you're talking about anaerobic digestors, they're usually standalone units. Oftentimes, they have been implemented so far for agricultural residues and sewage sludge, and we're now looking at food scraps going into those either separately or in combination with some of those other feedstocks. So anaerobic digestion has a bunch of options, and bioreactors is another whole realm of activity.
Is it correct, Gary, as I understand it, that there's a time duration piece that generally landfill bioreactors, as it was said, was rather than decades in a landfill, it's years, but anaerobic digesters are actually weeks of before it's much quicker in terms of moving the material through, right, and usually done in an enclosed steel or concrete vessel, right, as opposed to the...
Getting energy out of a landfill through bioreactors or any other way is the least efficient way of getting energy out of anything. It's not designed to do that. It's a byproduct of getting rid of your waste and doing it a little bit better than you used to do it. But anaerobic digesters are focused, designed to control everything, having everything very clearly above ground, monitored, that you can accomplish what you're trying to accomplish and do it more efficiently and more quickly, as you said.
Okay, thanks. Okay, next up.
I've got several comments for anyone that doesn't know me. I'm Roger Gazowski. I'm the current Five College recycling manager, and I'm somebody that's lived or worked more than 3 decades here in Northampton. And the remainder of that time have actually worked and probably spent as much time as Gary has over those 6 years in the California Waste Board offices talking about waste reduction, recycling. I'm a former vice chair of both the Mass Recycle College and University Recycling Council and the NRC's College and University Recycling Council, and I'm here to offer some other perspectives. We'd like to thank Gary for coming, and for anyone that doesn't know some of the background, Gary has worked closely with some other groups like Californians Against Waste to pass some landmark legislation in California, AB 939, which got them to the tremendous 50% diversion rate that they've achieved so far. One of the things that I also want to make sure that people are talking about is how we've gotten to 50% diversion, because there's assumptions in there that are also included in this discussion that don't necessarily relate to the elimination of a landfill.
Clarification, when you say we've gotten 50%, meaning California or Massachusetts?
California getting to 50%, we getting to the situation we're at now where we're discussing zero waste as an alternative to the landfill, because the two are not the same issue. California's gotten to 50% through what some of us might call fraudulent accounting. An awful lot of the composting data that goes in the state of California is used as alternative daily cover. It's collected in a way that there are no farmers or landscapers that will largely touch the material. It's mixed with a lot of industrial sewage sludge, and the only viable option for it is largely to use as alternative daily cover. That's included in that 50%. Also included in that 50% is some really horrible assumptions about paperless office. You're allowed to essentially count up emails sent as a state agency, as if every one of those emails sent would eliminate a sheet of paper and would have gotten mailed to you as an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. Count that as diversion. You're allowed to basically count up the acreage of grass that you don't rake up and apply a single mathematical number as if grass grows uniformly in Death Valley the same way that it does up in Arcata and borderline wetlands. That gets to 50%. We're talking about getting rid of, and we've already grabbed the low-hanging fruit to get to 50 in California. Now you're talking about getting the remaining 50% to get to zero waste. To put that in perspective here in Northampton, 2011 is essentially when our landfill's closing. The other remaining landfills in Western Mass are all closed by 2013 or 2016. That's not a long period of time for a public works project. That leaves us with zero viable alternatives right now for our trash here in Western Mass. So to get from where we are now to zero in a 2-year period, I would challenge anyone to come up with a logical plan for how we're going to do that, to say we don't need a landfill in the short term. In the long term, I applaud efforts to try and get to zero waste. But I'd throw out a couple of anecdotes. We have a goal of 0 fires. Does that mean we stop funding the fire department here in Northampton? We have a goal of 0 ignorance. Does that mean we stop funding the school department here in Northampton? We have a goal of 0 crime. Does that mean we stop funding the police department here in Northampton? The point is there are unpopular public projects. They're costly. They deal with the less favorable elements of our society. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we can bury our heads in the sand and pretend that they don't exist. So some perspective for folks that are out there. State of California over the last approximately 6 years has spent several hundred millions of dollars on zero waste planning. I challenge anyone to find that the state of California has achieved zero waste for all of that money. 3 of the 5 largest landfills in the country, and quite probably in the world, are within the state of California or just outside its borders to handle the trash coming from the state of California. Because again, transfer is great because you can pass it into a desert climate right next door, make your problem Nevada's, make your problem Arizona's. If you strip away most of those questionable accounting practices, the state of California has a recycling rate that's about that of Arizona's. And there's nobody here in this room that's trumpeting up the idea that we should be achieving Arizona's recycling rate and using Arizona as a model. So I also find it curious that we're talking to Department of Public Works about zero waste, as if Department of Public Works will achieve zero waste. Zero waste by its very practice is that it should be a presentation to purchasing departments, it should be presentations to businesses. Department of Public Works by its very nature is dealing with the back end of all of this. There's absolutely nothing Department of Public Works is going to do to achieve zero waste and get us to zero. And part of the reason that all of these programs have failed is quite frankly zero waste for all of its good intentions. And I'd argue that none of those intentions are anything new. Pretty much all of them are reiterations of the basic reduce, reuse, recycle mantra that we've had for 20 years. But they basically violate the basic laws of physics. There's a law of thermodynamics that says no process is 100% efficient. Basic law of physics. That missing inefficiency we call waste. We can change the term all we want, but it doesn't change that basic principle that some degree of waste is going to be generated. So the question is, what do we do with that material? Most of the elements that we've actually looked at for zero waste plants already exist in the region. We have a restore nearby. CET's done a fantastic job of creating one in Springfield. We have a materials recovery facility. We already have 3 C&D processors, if you include under construction, right in the area. We've got plenty of scrap metal markets. Most of the elements that I went through the list, we already have to get us to where we are now. In 2 years, we're not going to go from that to zero. The other piece that I would very strongly argue, there's a lot of sort of boogeymen that get thrown around in the discussion about the landfill. The landfill's not particularly popular. And one of the disadvantageous statistics that's out there is that 80% of our waste comes from commercial haulers. That's not big waste haulers like Waste Management hauling stuff from 5 states away to come dump it in our landfill. When we talk about the number of communities that are dumping waste, most of those are the small local haulers that have an account in South Hadley. They're picking up a gas station as part of their route, and they're coming back and picking up 20 other commercial stops here in Northampton and dropping it in our landfill because that's where their business is located and where the predominance of their business and clientele is located. So this sort of specter that all of this waste is coming from outside of town, there's definitely some of it. I'm not going to argue that this is not a regional landfill. That was part of the permitting process to have a landfill in the first place, is that DEP is basically in an attempt to limit landfills, which is something we've all agreed to do, gone to a more regional-based approach. As we eliminated flow control, or actually as the Supreme Court eliminated flow control as an option, we can no longer fund these kinds of public works projects. So we had to go to regional landfills to attract business. On that same token, some of the other alternatives that are being proposed as an alternative to this current expansion that we're talking about, I gotta tell you, don't pass the sniff test. We couldn't even build a recycling facility here in Northampton because we didn't have enough tonnage to do one alone. That's why we have a regional facility in Springfield. So to suggest that we're going to be building pyrolysis plants, anaerobic digesters, which you need a head of cattle about 500 strong to be able to justify the economics for, or any of the other emerging technologies that are multi-billion-dollar projects in some cases, it is unrealistic and misleading, and unfortunately, we have a number of folks that have properties next to the landfill that are desperate for hope that suddenly that they won't have a landfill next door, and my heart bleeds for them. I understand what that's like to wake up and realize that there's stuff next door to you that you hoped wasn't there. But the fact is that some of those hopes are unrealistic, and I think you're leading folks down a very dangerous path.
Roger, you've raised several points, and I want to ask actually for some clarification, and also myself give a clarification, which I think is important, which is the goal here tonight, my understanding, well, actually, I want to go back to the basis. The Board of Public Works realizes it needs to study alternatives because they want to make sure that whatever direction they go, they've explored other things. They have not decided what alternatives they want to study. They really don't know. And actually, I want to say, sort of for full disclosure here, they talked about whether some of these alternatives shouldn't even be talked about tonight and present them because they seem so outlandish. And I want to say, I encourage them to say, no, talk about them, because the public needs to hear all the information. Even if some of these technologies don't make sense here, it would not be right to leave them out, because you folks need to be informed about that. But they have not made up their mind on those. And I want to also remind you, that's really important for them to hear from you tonight. As Roger was saying, that input on, as I hear you, if I hear you right, you're saying don't even spend your time studying those because you're saying they're not even worthwhile. But that's really important for them to know what should be the scope of their study. I also want to ask, you touched on the commercial, 80% is commercial, and if somebody from the city could clarify And my understanding is, and I'm not sure if I'm following this right, 80% is from commercial haulers, but some percentage of that is actually residential waste. Is that right?
The 80% question is pretty vexing, and it's come up in several occasions, and I'll try it again to give it a shot to explain what the 80% is. The 80% of the waste that the city classifies as commercial, we define as commercial, is brought in by private commercial haulers. But those private commercial haulers, many of them that are small haulers, as Roger has suggested here, are picking up people's waste. Maybe some of the folks that live in Northampton or East Hampton or Hatfield, people that hire haulers to come to their home and pick up their waste. Not everybody in Northampton uses the drop-off centers. I happen to use the drop-off center. I get a sticker like a lot of other folks and bring my bag up to Locust Street and do it that way. I don't know, do we have a sense, Karen, of how many homes in Northampton use curbside, private curbside? So about half of our community uses the drop-off center. They get this vehicle sticker, they buy the stickers for their bags. The other half have do-so trucking, waste management, pedal people, come to their home, pick up that waste. When that waste is delivered to the landfill, that's classified as commercial waste because it's being brought in by a commercial hauling company. But the majority of the waste that's coming in it would be classified in the industry as residential waste because it's being picked up at homes. It's being picked up at your home, your home, people's homes in East Hampton. They don't have a landfill. They don't have a transfer station there. I bet almost all the residential solid waste from East Hampton is coming to the landfill as quote-unquote commercial waste. And I think that's the thing that's difficult for us is we can't put an actual tonnage on that because the waste is being brought from people's homes into the landfill, but it's being hauled by private companies that have no obligation to us to tell us what that tonnage is. So we could make estimates and, you know, I could post some numbers on the website in terms of per capita generation and what we think the residential waste stream is that's coming in through commercial haulers, and we could do that. But the bottom line is that we don't have any mechanism to determine the precise tonnage of residential waste that's coming in. It's all grouped into that 80% commercial, so that's mainly residential waste coming in from Northampton, East Hampton, Hatfield, surrounding communities, area businesses in Northampton, the downtown area. That's the material that's coming in the landfill. We're not getting waste from New York City. We're not getting waste from long haul distances. It's the waste shed that's right in and around our community. That's the best I can describe it, and I think Roger did a pretty good job at kind of getting us off there.
And if I can leave with one last quick question, comment.
Well, before you do that, actually, if you don't mind, and maybe you can give a quick answer to this. I wanted to ask you, because you painted what seemed like a pretty bleak picture of all the low-hanging fruit is already picked. Could you identify what would be the next piece of fruit in this area to move diversion forward? Is there something that could be done?
I think people have touched on the organic piece. I think that's definitely an element here, but that's a tricky nut here in Northampton because so much of our organic waste is coming from restaurant staff. You've got a very high level of turnover. You don't have a local market at this point. One of the things that Massachusetts has some, in my opinion, fantastic regulations about. My biggest frustration during the time I spent in California was I was in the heart of the Central Valley with nothing but agriculture around me, and I couldn't find anyone to take food waste from the university. There's something horribly wrong with that scenario. One of the things that Massachusetts, I think, has done very right is allowed local farms to take a certain percentage of off-farm food waste. It keeps the scale at a level that folks are able to manage. One of the things I would suggest, having dealt with this, is that the interest in that is far greater than the infrastructure for that. So one of the things that's happened is it scared off some farmers from entering into that field because they've seen some of the horror stories in the past where the minute they say, yes, I will take this, they get every type of organic material. Someone touched on the biodegradable plastics earlier. There's a lot of that entering that compost stream that local farmers aren't prepared to handle yet. They're not quite ready for that ramp-up piece. So there's some distinct infrastructure. I think there's a lot of opportunities, but we're not going to go from where we are to zero anytime close to 2 years. And with that, we've actually sort of come full circle. So because she was old enough that I don't think she can be with us any longer, and I think she may have passed away, there's a question that was posed right here in one of the surrounding hill towns 20 years ago. when recycling in its modern form took off, and we were promoting that recycling was going to eliminate the need for landfills. I've actually asked Gary this question at some public forums before. I've asked Eric, who's another one of the great zero waste advocates.
We do have to move along.
Right.
I'm getting some
But-
signals from out
The quick question is, what do we do with condoms? If we're going to achieve zero waste, what do we do?
I've got the easy answer for that.
Good.
Take back program. But more seriously, the whole point of zero waste, or darn close, is you strive to get to zero, but you're not having to deal with every last bit. So don't get hung up on zero. It's working to design a system that can take as much as you can out, as quick as you can, with the highest value that you can. But it's not necessarily going to address every last ounce tomorrow.
No, but I would also argue that darn close gets us into the same accounting fraud that California is at.
We've got to keep moving.
Right.
We can circle back at this time. Thank you, Ryan. Next up.
Hi, so my name is Sylvia Brody. I'm the lead organizer with Toxics Action Center, and so I want to speak quickly because I don't live here in Northampton. We're a New England-wide public health and environmental nonprofit that works side by side with residents to clean up and prevent pollution in neighborhoods. We have an office in Amherst and an office in Boston, and we have been working on solid waste issues and zero waste for about 5 years now here in New England, in particular up in Vermont, where we've been working directly with the Central Vermont Solid Waste District, which is a group of 22 towns that have set a zero waste goal and started implementing a zero waste plan in recent years. And so I'm really excited about the interest here in Northampton about zero waste. I also just want to thank you all for being here today and for your presentation, and for the board for having this forum. I have a couple comments and also a question. First of all, I know that Northampton has a population that enjoys a reputation of being innovative and forward-thinking, and so I think that and that the city has adopted a sustainability plan, and I think that a foundational principle of zero waste is a sustainable method for capturing and preserving our resources, and that just fits right into what the city says that they want to do. A zero waste plan can make money for the city, potentially can create jobs, can save energy, and can reduce pollution from waste disposal sites. So one thing I was wondering is whether HDR or Gary, whether you know anything about the Zanker Road landfill in California, because I did a little bit of research and was looking at this facility in particular. I can talk about it a little bit, but about what I know as a potential sort of incremental step as the city considers adopting something like a zero waste goal.
Yeah, I was the solid waste manager in San Jose that wrote the solid waste facility permit for Zanker Road landfill, where they came in, wanted to open up an old landfill to properly close it out. And I said, no, you have to do some recycling as part of that. And said you have to do at least 25% recycling, and put that in their permit. They said, and that's impossible. I told them, go down to Fresno, Portland, other places, look. They came back and said, okay, we'll do it. They ended up achieving 95% waste diversion over the last 7 or 8 years. They've extended the life of their landfill by about 40 years. They have invested in major technology and innovation. One of the conditions we wrote into the permit is that they must charge less for source-separated materials, which was one of the keystones to their success. Zanker is one of the stars that we highlight as an example.
Yeah, I would encourage that to be something that's looked at in this alternative study as a potential model. And also, I just wanted to touch on the composting question because I've just heard a lot of skepticism about whether this can be done effectively. the Central Vermont Solid Waste District has really focused on setting up a system to compost all organic materials. There's actually a ban on throwing away organics. And so I would really encourage the city to talk with folks from Vermont. I mean, there are experts on zero waste that are here on the East Coast. Donna Barlow-Kesey is the director of the Central Vermont Solid Waste District, and she's very knowledgeable about zero waste and especially about the composting, the commercial composting program that they have set up and are running up there that has been very successful so far and is expected to end up making a lot of money for the region. And she's actually really interested and available to talk with anyone from the city that would be interested in speaking with her and could come down to Massachusetts to do that. I also just want to encourage the board and the city to consider extending this study, delaying the expansion vote, convening a working group. I think that there's a real opportunity here in Northampton to do something progressive around waste, and there are a number of consultants. I think it would be worth getting a number of consultants together, whether involving maybe all of you at the table here, Donna Barlow-Kesey up in Vermont, an economist, potentially a consultant chosen by residents, potentially a citizen from the city, an employee of the city into a small working group to work to come up with a zero waste plan, or at something moving towards that would work for Northampton. So I'd really encourage that. And then the last thing I do want to do is actually echo something that was already said and encourage everyone here to participate in the statewide process that's going on. The state of Massachusetts right now is rewriting its solid waste master plan for the next 10 years, and this will definitely affect what's going on here in Northampton. The Department of Environmental Protection is considering doing a number of things that are, I think, really forward-thinking.
I got to ask if you could try to wrap up in a minute, because
Yeah.
I need to see how many more people need to speak and give board members time if they have questions.
1 minute
Sure.
is all I want.
Absolutely. I only need 30 more seconds. So there are a lot of great things about the plan that the state is proposing. They also are proposing repealing the moratorium on building new incinerators in Massachusetts, which would be in direct conflict with any sort of zero waste plan. And I encourage people to turn out to the stakeholder meetings that will be held to talk about future policies for the state on this issue. There's one in Holyoke on Tuesday, January 6th, from 5 to 8 p.m., and I imagine we can get that posted on a bunch of websites. But thank you so much again, and I appreciate the opportunity to make comments as well.
Thank you. We'll take the last one.
Believe me, it'll be a lot briefer.
Quick clarification, because Sylvia talked about extending the study. The study has not started, is that correct?
The option study?
Yeah.
It has begun.
It has begun. Yes. Oh, okay.
The Mount Tom Power Plant, when Deval Patrick got in, is one of the dirty five, and he wanted to shut it down. He can't do it because we can't find replacement power. Wouldn't it make an awful lot of sense to go to Japan and look at a plasma gasification project, possibly? Put it next to that plant, and you have the infrastructure for wiring, you have rail siding, and you have interstate highway nearby. The only problem I see with it, Northampton doesn't get any money out of it.
So I need to, by a show of hands, we do have comment cards. I first want to ask of board members, and I don't know which ones, I don't remember, but how many board members have questions or comments still left to make? Okay. And then of other members of the public, how many have a remaining comment to make? One. Okay. So let's take board members first, then we'll take the last comment, and then we will adjourn. Would that be?
Why don't we, at this point, if we could, if you don't mind, I'd like to close the public comment period and go back to the board meeting. It is getting late. I do appreciate everyone hanging in there, especially our speakers, and we're all starting to get pretty exhausted. And so before we get to the point where no one can think straight anymore, I would like to close the public comment period and thank Jeff so much for his work.
Can you make your comment in 20 seconds?
Very short.
Dinger.
All right. My comment is this. We are looking at either expanding the landfill, looking at zero waste. We don't even have an idea of how much it would even be to cost. We don't have any cost at all on how much it's going to be, even if we wanted to expand the landfill. We need to know costs up front before we go forward.
Okay, and very well done. Timely.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And now at this point, the public is absolutely welcome to stay if you've got the endurance. But what I want to do is then open the floor up for questions from the board. And so please, if you've got a question.
There's been a lot of discussion about the quality of the waste stream. I assume if there's some kind of aerobic or anaerobic digester, that's particularly important. If we were to maintain a more typical landfill operation, does the quality of the waste stream matter?
For landfilling?
Other than the obvious advantage of minimizing it, but
Typically, no.
no.
I mean, that's the whole purpose of it, to take whatever left over.
We can talk about Nantucket a little bit if you want, in terms of what their model is.
But the composting?
Well, it's got a MSW composting facility and the residuals landfill,
Right.
the material we can't use.
Actually, I was prompted at the Halifax situation. In Halifax, Nova Scotia, in order to expand their landfill, the deal that they made with their residents was that they would pre-process everything before it went into the ground. And that's similar to the MBT requirements under approaches that are being used in Europe in response to the European Union landfill directive, which requires the phase out of organics out of landfills. As part of that landfill directive in Europe, they not only require the phase out of organics, but they also require pre-processing before things go into the ground. Halifax has implemented that for about 10 years as part of their approach to assure that anything that goes into the ground, they've leached out any toxics and got all the organics out. So what's going into the ground is inert. That's the theory behind it. So when you talk about the quality of the waste going to the landfill, I'd agree with Alan that it's a landfill traditionally is to take everything, but there are other approaches that are evolving associated with this as part of the system approach. That if you require a pre-processing. And what Halifax does is they have a clean stream for organics, source separated, pick up everything at the curb, at least for the yard trimmings piece, and anything that gets to the landfill that hasn't been picked up through source separation, that's organic, is covered by the digestion that goes on the surface prior to it going into the ground.
Do Massachusetts regulations and laws allow us to look realistically at options other than entombment? I mean, in Europe they keep it wet. Here we keep it dry. Can we realistically look at options? Are they cost effective? Are they allowed?
Yeah.
Well, I think the answer to that, I think, is yes. And in some cases, as a matter of existing regulation, in some cases as a matter of beneficial use determinations, in some cases as a matter of as the evolving regulations, you heard a comment come back with one of the things they're contemplating is, in fact, lifting the incinerator moratorium, which has been in place for since the master plan went in place. So I think to answer your question, I think you were specifically talking about a bioreactor approach or just other technology?
Not necessarily. I just wonder if it all becomes somewhat moot based on the state regulations. These options.
No. The one of part of the reason for this forum and part of what the presentation was to present what people have heard about and what people have talked about in terms of options.
Mm-hmm.
What we're trying to do is to say of those, what makes sense to study here. And the option, and there are a couple of small communities like Nantucket and Marlborough and so forth that have some composting operations in front of their landfills. and processing in that respect to preserve and extend the life of the landfill. And the key, and to me, one of the keys in a successful composting operation is to have a separated stream which is relatively clean, so you get a clean compost.
So it goes back to the.
It goes back to your collection practices. It goes back to what you can do realistically and how much you're willing to spend, which is and especially now when budgets are being cut, how much can you afford and how much are you willing to spend? Meaning the residents willing to spend.
Would municipal collection, in your experience, is municipal collection a way to impact the quality of the stream, or is this something that can be done with private haulers just as easily? Is there a model for pressing the private haulers to?
I think Jim wants to say something.
Yeah, I guess I'll do There's a little bit of history, and I think these guys may know more of the history, maybe just because they're older, but the issue of compost quality is sort of there's a long history associated with that, and I think back in the start of MSW composting of mixed solid waste product results in generally a poor quality end product that has metals and other things that become problematic in terms of reuse. But I think nowadays, everyone here has stated that if you have clean feedstock when it goes into a compost operation, if you've got source separated food waste, for example, it's a great product. Leaf and yard waste is a good product. If you can keep the inputs into your composting operation clean, you're going to come up with a product that anybody can use, and it's safe to use, and it's clean, and you can test it. But some of these mixed waste composting facilities that have been established results in a product that you may only be able to use as an alternative daily cover. So it's there could be some market incentives there to, and there is a lot of interest. I think Roger had said as well, and I think everybody knows that there's a lot of interest in food waste composting.
And what I was saying about the Halifax piece was that they have both the clean stream and the composting digestion at the landfill. The composting at the landfill, digestion at the landfill is not intended to be marketable product. It's an environmental mitigation, environmental remediation, environmental protection tool, not developing a marketable product. And that was the interesting combination of the Halifax approach. But as far as the question about is there a way of controlling the haulers? Yes, that's what all these communities are doing. Under Massachusetts law, they would need to, others may need to explore how to accomplish that. But that's what a lot of communities are doing. That's what I was stressing about policies, the new rules, the incentives, mandating that haulers provide a certain amount of recycling services. I heard that, for example, here you have to pay more to recycle on top of your garbage bill. So you could, in another place, you might adopt an ordinance saying haulers must offer recycling service for free or 50% less than garbage service and provide equal amount of recycling and garbage service.
So you think
you could do by ordinance?
A cost model is probably the most effective way to impact what comes in?
Looking at the hauling, look at what sort of policies, what sort of rules, what sort of regulations, ordinances can be adopted under your existing authority under state law, and maybe even ask for new legislation as part of the new state master plan, if you need it, to be able to control your destiny rather than just letting it flow haphazardly.
Terry, a key part of that is the haulers have to have a place to bring the stuff.
Right.
That's a key part of it. So facility development, whatever it is, if it's food waste composting.
No matter what, you need the facilities, right?
Methane, is methane mitigated by burning it? If we run it into a generator, if we burn it in a flare?
If it's controlled, yes. That's the point. You need to control it. A landfill generally doesn't control. IPCC could be as little as 20% of the average landfill worldwide of the methane is controlled. So in a controlled digester, you're getting it all. In a landfill, you're not necessarily doing that over the life of the landfill, and because of a bunch of details which we could elaborate on if you want.
And then finally, you showed the circle of drop-off. Is there a way to use those experiences in designing a landfill? Are those experimental, or are they fairly well documented by this point, as far as the effectiveness of the circle compared to just one drop-off versus, are these ideas, or have these been worked out fairly well by now?
The resource
With experience and results, and
there's lots of examples of resource recovery parks around the world. They're naturally evolving at transfer stations and landfills. All we're saying is design for them, because you keep adding these pieces. Why not just design for it? Because we know that it makes sense. Let's get the flow right. Let's get the incentives right. Let's design for it, because nobody wants things in their backyard. So existing transfer stations, existing landfills become a natural place to add the additional processing capacity. And so if you're going to be doing that, make sure you separate the residential from the commercial traffic. Make sure you get the gate fees at the right point. You know, that's the whole idea. And there's examples of that, some of which is documented, some of which needs to be.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, other board members?
I have a couple of quick follow-up questions. How much, do you have a sense of a guesstimate of a cost to have a recovery park? Does it pay for itself? I mean, is there
the Assembly Obispo, which is a more simple resource recovery center, because there's processing capacity elsewhere, is $100,000, basically asphalt paving and concrete blocks. I love that model as an example of someone that's done something tangibly, that just did it, and it definitely pays for itself. Plus, they have the FU fee, the facility use fee. The facility use fee, which was named, I think, purposely, was they actually have an entry fee to come into the facility, and then if people have stuff left over that they can't put into the recycling reuse areas, and they have to go to the landfill area, they have to pay an additional $20 a ton. That's the facility use fee for the landfill purpose. Again, it's a combination of design, physical design, flows, and financial incentives, getting the signals right to get people to participate the way you want them to.
Thank you.
But as far as the cost, that's the least cost one that I know of for a resource recovery center. Del Norte, we estimated in our feasibility study it would be about $1 million. Came in about $2 million for a population of 30,000. They get a little bit more rain than other places that we've worked with, so they had to design more intensively than we were thinking about. The feasibility studies we did in Del Norte and the UK showed those types of order of magnitude for the basic collection systems and some processing. But again, it's all the pieces, what pieces you need really depends on what you've got locally. You've got stuff we've heard, you've got your MRF, you've got your restore. You don't need everything at the site. The site, a site or multiple sites might be locations for multiple things. You could even get Waste Management to build a resource recovery park at their landfill if you don't want it in town as another option. They did one in Davis Street because that was the local culture wanted them to do more than just landfill.
Thank you. And I have a question for us. Is there a deadline that we have to make a decision by, a deadline date for this?
For our decision as to whether to go forward with a special permit? No.
Okay.
As far as I know.
And then do we have a next step, like how we're going to move forward in getting costs and developing the study?
The next step is one of the next steps, and a very important one, will be the next public forum
which is will be an opportunity for HDR and Stantec to present the option study to the board and to the public. That won't occur for some time. We don't know exactly when. So that's a very important next step, and maybe one of the last steps before we make a decision.
And then we'll have costs, right?
We'll have costs at that point, yeah.
But when are we going to sort of develop the parameters of the study in terms of like, I mean, I'd really like to explore.
Right now, we're trying to scope the study, and so at the completion of this meeting, we'll have some notes, and then we'll work on a rescoping document for HDR Stantec. And when that would happen? A couple of weeks.
And then we'll have input, the board will have input into the scope of the study?
Oh yeah, we'll discuss it at our next meeting. And for those of you who are interested, our next meeting is Monday the 24th. I think is the date, 5:30 at the DPW boardroom.
November 24th?
Yeah. Terry, did you have a question? Oh, Mike, okay.
Thanks. Good evening, I'm Mike Parsons. Actually, my comments are more to the board members and to HDR, and it really takes off on the comments on the scope of the study. You know, what I've heard tonight is that there isn't much interest in some of the new technologies, and so I come away from this meeting not interested in Northampton developing a waste energy plant or a pyrolysis plant or anaerobic digesters. From what I heard from the group, that there's a very strong interest in waste reduction. I think that's important, but as a board member, we need to have a new solution in place by 2012. And so we really don't have much time left. And the other reality that we face is the city's been getting a lot of financial benefits from the landfill that Jim described at the beginning of the meeting. And as we look at evaluating alternatives, I want to make sure that in looking at the costs, it comes across as to whether or not we preserve those financial benefits with each alternative, or whether because of market constraints or some other constraints, we have to give up those benefits. And I would assume that would come across in the study, but we certainly need to see that. I think it's critically important that as we make a decision, we know whether or not we're going to be giving up the host community fee, for example, because we need those monies for something else. So as I heard the discussion, it seems like we're looking at an expansion of the landfill with possible organic composting, but certainly if we're going to go in that route, we need to have a very high level of assurance that we can find a use for the end product. As Jim mentioned, and even with a clean waste stream, there's a huge risk in building a facility like that, and to build one and not know what's going to happen to the end product or have some high degree of confidence in what's going to happen to the end product, I don't think would make sense for the city. And then the other options are closing the landfill. And one is let the city continue to handle waste recycling and transfer on an expanded basis, and we certainly need to look at that. And then certainly get out of the solid waste business altogether. And so as we think of those options, we certainly need to try to identify the cost increases to the residents and the businesses if we go that route. So there could very likely be a loss of revenue to the city, but also an increase in cost to the residents. And I think there'll probably be more discussion on this at the board meeting next week, but that's where I think this, well, from what I've heard tonight, that's where this is all headed. We can control the cost to the residents through waste reduction, but in the next few years, we're not going to make, it's hard for me to believe that we're going to make such significant strides that it will have a significant outcome or a significant impact on the issues that we face today.
Right, thanks. Thanks. Susan, you had a question?
Well, I think I was afraid Mike wasn't going down the road of what happens if we close the landfill and what those costs will be to the resident. I'm very interested in that, as I've said before.
Okay, other board members? No, Gary, Jay? No other questions? If I could, then I had a question a while back, and I guess this is returning to the resource recovery part. Again, are there nearby examples of facilities like this for a community our size that we could point to and take a look at, number one, and number two, about what level of diversion would you expect from resource recovery park concept, again, for a community our size?
I think, well, locally, I mean, in terms of, it's not what we call it social recovery park, but, you know, Wells and comes to mind as having a multi-stop operation that they use fairly well in terms of using and recycling. You have some of those elements already in place.
And a bunch of places, we just named them resource recovery parks, they didn't call themselves that.
Right.
If they have the attributes of the things we're talking about, a bunch of all these, reuse, recycling, composting, co-located, it might be something.
I mean, the pieces are in a lot of different communities, and you know, even you have parts at Glendale already, you don't call it that, but you have your recycling there, you have the composting there, you have the landfill, gas recovery. But if you look at the community, you have a lot of pieces at the drop-off centers already.
So you're saying there's not a lot more?
I don't think there's a lot, well, not necessarily. Okay. I mean, the issue is, one of the things to look at the study is what can be done and what would it cost to do it. What can be done longer term, with if, say, as it turns out, you might need to have a disposal option, obviously, because you're not going to divert that much waste. Given that diversion, now, you know, what are you going to do longer term to reduce the amount of waste you have to dispose of, and ultimately, if you have your landfill, extending the life of the landfill. So there are short-term things you can do, intermediate things, and long-term things that you can start to think about, whether to advocate on the state level, whether to do things with the business community, and so forth. So those are the types of things I think we should try and think about looking at.
Okay. So just to clarify that, then going a little further down the road of resource recovery is not going to substantially reduce or divert additional waste. Is that what you're saying?
No. I would say that the contrary. The point is that when we do zero waste plans, we call it a service opportunity analysis, and look at what's missing in terms of you look at what services are provided, what waste are showing up in the waste stream, and then you look at what's missing, and compared to other communities that have done other things. And for the resource recovery part piece, clearly food composting, one we heard was a huge thing, which in an average community is 10 to 20% of the residential stream. In San Francisco, it's 25%. I heard comments here that it might be higher because of all your restaurants for the commercial stream. So food and food paper is a huge piece that clearly there's a service gap. We used to call it a gap analysis, we now call it an opportunity analysis, an opportunity to do something more. On C&D recycling, I heard reference to 3 facilities in the area. I would look at, do you need any other C&D operations? There may be some types of C&D, like the Restore focuses on used building materials, but it doesn't talk about taking demolished buildings and grinding it for road base. Those types of pieces.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I had a different concept in mind, but thank you.
Right.
Okay. Any other questions from the board? Nothing. Okay, well then, at this point, I entertain a motion to adjourn.
Aye.
A lot of public support on that one. Thanks so much, everyone, for coming.